Hello guys, welcome back to my channel and enjoy this fanfic part 2. Now let's start the fanfic. Naruto couldn't stop a slight smile as he walked through the streets of Suna, as he'd done many times in the past, or future. Though most of the people here looked somewhat wary of him, there were some who greeted the supposed Jiraiya with genuine smiles and friendly nods. Getting into his role took a little mental gymnastics, though the few years he'd spent alongside the Toad Sage while they traveled throughout the Land of Fire and surrounding nations certainly gave him plenty to work with. Certainly a lot more than he usually would have had for an infiltration mission. Of course, most of that was the more carefree, lecherous Jiraiya. For a meeting with the Kazekage, even he would have gotten serious. Naruto had infiltrated Suna. Once, with Gaara's knowledge he'd gotten close to a suspected information broker who was thought to be in contact with foreign spies, and he'd followed the man for the better part of 3 days before he'd finally struck gold. That had been early in his career, and in retrospect he'd drawn out things for far too long. "Were your border guards sleeping on the job?" Naruto asked after a while as he wandered after his guide, his eyes roving over the oddly bulbous buildings that were one of the characteristic features of the village, the sandstone walls being another. "Given your surprise at my arrival, I take it that you didn't spot me until I was right at the wall. Are the border guards getting rusty?" Admittedly, Naruto had noticed a handful of scouts along the way here, but they hadn't spotted the genin. The Land of Wind was pretty huge and empty, especially in peacetime, so he'd simply taken some of the lesser-used trails, taking him rather close. It also helped make him seem more formidable than he really was, when in reality he was simply taking advantage of a security flaw that wasn't fixed until Gaara came to power. Of course, the village itself was very effectively defensible, as if to make up for the situation outside it. Located in a rocky valley, it was already solidly protected from attack by any significant force and surrounded by plenty of ammunition for powerful Doden techniques. The Chunin didn't answer his query. Of course, he probably wouldn't even have done it if Naruto had appeared as himself. Suna's shinobi had always had a pretty strong grasp on discipline, and the fact that Gaara's father was said to be even stricter than his son certainly wouldn't make them any more laid back. A guest of the Hokage they'd definitely treat with respect, at least, and he reminded himself of his mission. 2 small scrolls in his pocket would make all the difference. Here, if he could prevent this particular piece of history, he'd be going above and beyond anything he'd done so far. Killing Mizuki and Gato were minor things. The former wouldn't have had much more influence anyway. After he was taken in, Gato's troops might still be a problem in the future, but they were at least leaderless now, and unlikely to go after Wave, which hardly had money to spare. Getting closer to his team, to make sure that things didn't degenerate into the mess that it had been the last time around, was more of a personal goal than anything. Although it was perhaps silly to think of it this way, he felt obligated to fulfill his promises to the Sakura, Kakashi and even Sasuke that he'd left behind. Instead of bringing him back, he'd make sure that Sasuke never had a reason to leave, and at the very least a friend to rely on, one that wouldn't just take a Chidori to the chest, at that. He'd make sure that he'd fulfill his promise to Sakura, and keep him around. He'd promised Kakashi, time and time again, that he'd be the Leaf's sword and shield and take care of the nasty things in the shadows, but that he'd never lose his spirit. Kakashi had jokingly ordered him to do that when he first donned the hat of the Hokage, and though it was said in jest at the time, Naruto had smiled and nodded. Sasuke, before the disastrous end of the Fourth Shinobi World War, in which the Uchiha clan was finally destroyed, they'd met once more on the battlefield. He'd had tears in his eyes, in his eternal Mangekyo Sharingan eyes. There, he'd made the last promise. A promise to the last Uchiha. Naruto glanced up and blinked as he realized that he'd been ignoring his guide for the last few minutes, far too wrapped up in his memories. Marshalling his thoughts, he focused on the here and now, leaving the rest for later. The two finally approached the huge spherical building that stood at the center of Suna. Naruto only remembered seeing it himself in the days that Gaara already ruled here, so spotting decorations and colorful banners was rather odd. His friend had never cared much for aesthetics, really. A tall man stood with his arms crossed before the entrance, wearing a loose-fitting blue kimono with a white jacket and an all-too-familiar hat. This was him, then, one of the few Kages he'd never met in person, due to his early death. The leader of Suna looked somewhere between stern and curious, his eyes clear and calculating. Naruto smiled hesitantly, leaving the Chunin escort behind. It was a popular misconception that one could sense someone's chakra, and determine their identity through that alone, perpetuated particularly among those who have little to do with actual shinobi. Naruto had spent far too much time with oblivious targets to really take that idea seriously any longer, and he was glad about it. Yes, a Hyuga would probably figure things out pretty quickly, and expose the fraud. Yes, a chakra sensor could potentially determine such things as elemental affinity which might differ from a target's. Yes, demonic chakra was rather noticeably different from the normal variety, and he'd have to make sure not to use any of it. All of that didn't change the fact that the vast majority of shinobi, genin or kage alike, couldn't do much more than gauge the relative amount of chakra that someone was unconsciously releasing through their tenketsu, without using some awfully obvious jutsu. Naruto didn't have to worry about how much chakra he had. Being a Jinchuriki and an Uzumaki made his reserves slightly ludicrous. Even when using dozens of shadow clones at a time, his main body remained responsive enough to be trouble for almost any shinobi. Disguising that much chakra required a lot of mental fortitude, though, and he'd found that it was time well spent to train such attributes. For one, it also helped him with planning. He'd never be among the best. He had always been a bit of an idiot when it came to a lot of things, and he didn't think that was technically a curable condition, but usually simpler plans worked just as well. His great amount of chakra had one very helpful characteristic. It was impossible to make more chakra than one normally could, to imitate another shinobi, but on the other hand chakra control would allow one to decrease the amount released subconsciously. In other words, if he had enough time he could imitate practically anyone's chakra amount, while Sakura would never be able to approach even half of the more powerful shinobi. Though, Naruto remembered, with the kind of skills she'd learned from Tsunade, she didn't need that. Thankfully he spent more than enough time with Jiraiya to have a pretty accurate idea of his chakra reserves, and he could match that easily enough. Kage dono, he muttered at last, bowing slightly. Jiraiya of Konoha, one of the notorious Sannin, the Kage responded. His gaze was sharp and judging as he took in the white-haired shinobi in front of him, glancing at the large scroll bound to his back for a brief moment. He gestured to the door. Please, come in. Naruto followed, appreciating the differences between the current building and the one that Gaara had maintained while he was the Kage. There were a lot more pictures and paintings around, this time, and there was a vaguely golden sheen to many things. That was probably courtesy of the Kage's manipulation of gold dust, which he'd used to respond to his letter. He was led to a sizable conference room that was presently empty, and a shiver ran down Naruto's back as he realized that this was the place Gaara usually met with civilian leaders and foreign Kage, as it was easily defensible. A large round table made of sandstone dominated the middle of the room, with chairs all around it. The door closed behind him with a muffled thump. It was then that the Kage turned to Naruto with narrowed eyes, raising his arm as a stream of gold dust spread around it, forming what appeared to be a glove. The letter you sent me contained a great deal of information that is not publicly known. Has Konoha fallen so low that they would spy on their own allies? Naruto swallowed. The information I gave in my message was that which I have personally found out, from sources outside this nation. There is a distinct lack of tactical information, as you might have realized. Knowing the personalities of foreign cage is merely good business, and hardly against any laws. He smirked as the cage scowled. As you have already surmised, the message I sent was a ploy to gain an invitation. A private one, at that. He raised his hand and a spinning blue sphere formed in it in an instant. Even the cage would recognize the Rasengan. I don't wish to get violent, but I will if I need to. You know my reputation. It's well earned. The cage stared suspiciously for a few long moments longer. Trickery to get a meeting, despite our nations being formal allies. Let us dispense with the pleasantries, my time is valuable. Why are you here? I haven't come by order of the Hokage, if that's what you're wondering, Naruto started. That's why I sent the letter. Though I respect him and his ability to keep secrets, there are those within the village that are less than honorable, and I would rather keep this matter from spreading too far. The Hokage has too many eyes and ears in his vicinity at all times. He put a hand in his pocket and retrieved a small scroll that he'd written himself, based on what he remembered. It contained the best information he had on the locations and identities of Odo's forces. The top was labeled by a symbol of two crows, one of the symbols he'd come to use in the wake of the Fourth Shinobi World War. Few realized it was in honor of a fallen clan. He cleared his throat and offered the scroll. A Konoha missing nin, my old teammate Orochimaru, is planning to assassinate you. The cage removed his hat, placing it on the table as he opened the scroll. For a time all was silent, as the man read the details with a critical eye, occasionally glancing at Naruto who had no trouble looking serious. This, too, was a critical moment. Finally, the man sighed. So, he wishes to double-cross me. Naruto blinked. The only way that sentence made sense was if Orochimaru had already made an agreement. How early had the plan to take down Konoha started? It was months yet until the Chunin exams. He narrowed his eyes as he spotted an opening. Konoha is not foolish. Orochimaru offered an alliance that would favor Suna. Together you agreed you would take down my village. You accepted. The cage's gold dust swirled agitatedly, as he shook his head. I place the good of my own village first and foremost, as is my duty as Kage. He hesitated briefly, and then sighed. So, Konoha knows. Naruto would have grinned if the timing wasn't so awful. We've known what Orochimaru was planning for some time, but recent events required intervention, he said, turning his glare at the cage. You were planning to break the alliance agreement with Konoha. Betrayal is a serious crime, and you will realize that something like this cannot be ignored. You may though it may be harder than you suppose, but that knowledge would not vanish. The most likely future that awaits you is filled with blood and strife. Right now, though, there is still a road away from the precipice of war. Compared to his original plan, to secure stronger ties with the cage and prevent his murder, this opened new possibilities. The man clearly had not expected Naruto to know about the would-be alliance with Orochimaru, and any element of surprise was now lost, it would seem to him. The cage, if he was half as wise as Gaara turned out to be, would realize that preventing a war with Konoha was worth quite a lot. They'd required another nation to even consider an invasion, and it was doubtful Odo would go beyond its agreements and actually defend the desert nation. You came here to state your demands, that's what this is about, the cage realized. Is that why Sarutobi isn't the one here? He would not have the heart for solving problems via underhanded trickery, I'm certain. You wished to stop a conflict without him aware that it would ever have happened, then. Naruto ignored the jibe, scowling. Cancel all agreements with Orochimaru and his shinobi, and there does not have to be a war of retaliation, this time. Right now, only a few people know about Orochimaru's plans, and 2/3 of them are in this room. Naruto worriedly realized that technically all of them were in this room, even if the real Jiraiya might already suspect some things. Make up for your transgression, and we will both walk away from this alive. The cage narrowed his eyes. How can you possibly offer this? You mean to tell me that Konoha would not pursue would-be invaders? I did not think your nation would have reconsidered the consequences of treachery. Naruto smiled. I never said there would be no toll on this road, did I? We will return to that. Turn on Orochimaru, and Konoha will not begin a war with you. We have a quarrel with Orochimaru, as you can imagine. It takes precedence over petty squabbles over ill-planned invasions. The destruction of Oto's shinobi forces would go a long way towards repairing the damage done by your mistake. You are asking me to betray your own teammate. Naruto shrugged. Is betraying those who would betray you so deplorable? Orochimaru will consider you a traitor, perhaps, but he won't dare to attack a cage in his own city, not without a lot of backup, which would start a war in itself. Conflict will erupt, of that there is no doubt. It will be with Konoha, or Oto. Choose wisely. The cage frowned, staring at the scroll for a long time. Finally he snarled and dropped it. You spoke of a toll. What is the price of this peace? Naruto smiled thinly. Your son. Dead last. Naruto's clone turned, blinking. Sasuke sat few feet away, his fingers entwined as he gazed with narrowed eyes over them. A shiver ran down his back as Naruto nodded. You've been keeping secrets, Sasuke stated. You're better than you've let on in the academy. Why? What? Why didn't I play the big show off, like you? Naruto snorted. You know how people treat me. It's not about something silly like playing pranks, either. As long as I was just a third-rate academy student, nobody would take notice of me, and I could study what I wished. It was the only way it could work. I don't have anyone to rely on. He stared at the Uchiha for a few moments. I figured you would understand that. Sasuke was silent for a few moments. How strong are you? Naruto shrugged. I never really went against anyone seriously, so I wouldn't know. Maybe we can have a little match sometimes, so you can tell me. I figure I'm stronger than Kiba, though. Sasuke nodded and turned away just as Sakura arrived, huffing and puffing. She took a few moments to catch her breath, before glaring at Naruto. Why did you let me run all the way here when you were both so much quicker? I had to take to the streets before I was halfway across the village. Naruto rolled his eyes. Sakura-chan, it was a race, that was sort of the point. A race that I won, by the way. Sasuke scoffed, looking away. Sakura muttered something uncomplimentary as she rubbed her feet from the long run. Well done, all of you, Kakashi stated as he dropped down next to them. Sakura nearly jumped a hole in the air in surprise. Sasuke and Naruto just raised a hand in greeting. Naruto, I think you'll find that you tied with Sasuke. I was watching. Naruto looked askance at Sasuke, and smirked. Next time, you're going down. Kakashi shook his head. There is clearly room for improvement, but I'm quite proud of all of you. Sasuke, you need to train more on your chakra control, as you left broken roof tiles from the village's gate all the way here. He looked sharply at the black and orange clad ball of energy next to him. Naruto, you really need to keep focus better. Sakura, well, you simply need to work on your chakra exercises, since your reserves are quite small, right now. That's also why you couldn't keep up the whole way. You had to stick to the streets after you kept slipping down the walls, after all. I need to keep better focus. Naruto muttered, glancing at Sasuke. It was a race, I was keeping up with Sasuke, what's a better focus than that? Perhaps if you'd thought for yourself, you would have realized that you were both taking a detour, and there was a quicker path to the target, Kakashi answered, smiling. Nevertheless, I am impressed by your improvement over only a few days, at least in technique. Naruto nodded eagerly, though he couldn't help feeling a little worried. He and his clone brethren had been alone for a few days now, getting closer to a week, and some of them were going a bit loopy. Kakashi probably hadn't connected the dots yet, but it wouldn't be much longer, now. The Kage Bunshin technique was never meant to be used as a long-term replacement clone. Extending the lifespan of existing clones by infusing them with the chakra of other ones would work for a while, but it did nothing to stop the mental decay. Shadow clones were approximations of the original, they weren't actually people, and their ability to absorb information was limited by what the chakra used to create them could sustain. Granted, Naruto's had a lot of chakra, but even his replicas had a limit, and that resulted in some peculiar behavior. Just yesterday, one of the clones that had been talking to Sakura had spontaneously decided to try and kiss her, and moved in. It took another clone and a sharp blow to end that particular copy's aspirations, and thankfully the girl hadn't said terribly much about the incident. The day before that, one of the longest living clones around had decided that there wasn't any reason in waiting and decided to take down Kabuto himself. He too was stopped by the others. This self-policing would work for a time, but sooner or later the defective clones would outnumber the regular ones. Thankfully, though, there were quite a few clones that ended up focusing on one particular aspect of the original's character. Some of those were good things. 2 clones had gotten thoroughly engrossed in making seals, to the point where they almost didn't need to talk anymore, understanding each other's thought processes instantly. They were technically the same person, after all. A third had ended up being an academic, interested in studying and spreading information. He was the first of the clones to mess up with the team and started expounding on things he really shouldn't, but the damage was minimal. Then, there was him. The clone that had focused on the team, to the exclusion of almost everything else. He'd promptly been chosen to continue working with them. He certainly hadn't complained. A stray thought about how strange it would be for the boss to receive such oddly warped memories from different aspects of himself occurred to him, but the clone figured that such thoughts were better left for someone else. I believe that we're just about done for the day, Kakashi noted, smiling. We'll go for another race when you've all had time to improve. There were 3 nods, and Naruto saw his opening. Kakashi-sensei, I finished that seal we talked about, he blurted suddenly, grabbing the small tube that contained it from his jacket. Before we go, could you take a look? He removed a single seal and quickly handed it to his teacher. This design was considerably more complex than the one he'd shown to Sakura, though it looked deceptively simple, due to the fact that several brush strokes were covered by others, separated only by a very thin layer of resin. It was a time-consuming process to make these, but he had half a dozen ready, and had already tested out one himself. Kakashi looked critically over the seal, glancing at Naruto with an uncomfortable level of respect. Naruto had a suspicion that the man was seeing rather someone else in his place. Well, we already finished today's mission, so I suppose we have a little time, Kakashi agreed. The seal quickly started to glow. He placed it on the ground and backed away. The seal sparked into activity and there was a brief but intense electric surge through the air as little arcs crisscrossed across the soil. The sound was remarkably similar to that of Kakashi's attack, the Chidori, and the man smiled in recognition. Finally it died down, and the seal fell apart into little pieces, burned out. That looked like it worked, Kakashi muttered, glancing speculatively at Naruto. You specifically made this for my attack, didn't you? That was too close to be a coincidence. Naruto rubbed the back of his head nervously. It's just an experiment. Really, I thought that it wouldn't make sense to make really generic ones, so I limited it the same way as your attack. Kakashi nodded, grabbing a second seal from Naruto's hand and, after a moment of consideration, placing it on the back of his own. Grasping his wrist, he prepared to unleash the Chidori. In an instant his hand sparked alight with the full force of the attack, and then some. The Raiden chakra coated his entire forearm now, and it didn't appear to be harming him. Incredible, he breathed, before quite suddenly the attack vanished, the last of the technique dissipating into the air. He coughed as acrid smoke spread from the burned-out seal. Great! Naruto exclaimed, turning to his teammates. Both of them had been looking on with interest, and Sasuke in particular was eyeing the seals. That looked pretty cool, Sakura admitted. Sasuke-kun, you should learn a lightning technique, then you could. Sasuke cut her off. Dead last. Naruto. Naruto looked at the Uchiha in surprise. Yes. Make one of those for Kaden, if you have the time. I'll test it for you. Naruto's smile couldn't be wider as he nodded eagerly. This is an admirable first version, though there are obviously some drawbacks to this design, Kakashi commented, tapping Naruto on the head and attracting his attention. I'd call it a C-class seal, which is actually pretty impressive for a genin. He gazed down with a stern look, then. No more experimentation until your teacher arrives, alright? Especially no tests with your teammates. One of those seals could you if you don't know what you're doing. Yes, sensei, Naruto answered tiredly. When is my teacher supposed to be here, anyway? Just keep an eye on the bathhouses, Kakashi muttered. You cannot be serious. The Kazekage exclaimed, fuming. Oh, don't worry, you're probably thinking of the wrong son, Naruto answered lightly, brushing his long white hair out of his face. I am talking about the one you attempted to assassinate on several occasions. The Kazekage glared. Gaara, why do you even bring this up? You know what he is. The Kazecage's gold dust swirled around his feet in agitation. I cannot afford to lose such a valuable asset merely for the promise of continued peace. The demon icing him, Naruto observed, and the Kazekage started. Shukaku is slowly draining away what little sanity the boy has left, and you're aware of it, otherwise, you would never have tested him. He savored the shock that appeared in the Kazecage's eyes at that statement. In time, you will not have a son, you will have the one tail free in your village, channeled through a mindless body. It will destroy the entire village before it bothers to move on. So, what? You are taking him away for the safety of Suna? The Kazekage asked. I don't believe a word of it. I am a seal master, as you know. Naruto silently apologized for stealing the title he'd hoped to gain himself, someday. I wish to repair the inferior seal the boy currently has. I will not, however, do this when there's a risk that he would be used as a weapon against us. As such, I would take him away from here, until such a time as our alliance is once more secure. Gaara cannot be controlled or reasoned with, the Kazekage said shortly. That is my concern, not yours. He will officially remain a shinobi of Suna, as he is now. Naruto shook his head, staring at the Kazekage. I will not take his choices from him, I will merely remove some of yours. I know you do not consider him of a higher value than this village's safety. I have experience with Jinchuriki, I know how to approach these beings. Take the offer. Gaara's freedom from Suna's loathing, that was one thing he could make sure of, now. Yes, the Kazecage's son would still be the insane murdering bastard he'd originally been at the Chunin exams. Yes, He'd probably get quite upset when he realized that the one who had bargained him away from Suna was no older than himself, at least physically, and had done so under false pretenses. The presence of the Kyuubi would probably not make things any easier, either. But it was Gaara. He understood what the boy was going through. One thing he'd definitely make sure was that Gaara would still be a Suna nin. If he ever wanted to be Kazekage again, he'd need that. Although the job had fallen into his lap rather than it having been a lifelong dream, he remembered well the long reign of the Godime Kazekage. Under his leadership, the village had flourished. Gaara had cherished the respect that he'd gained, just like Naruto, with their service to their home villages. Making a bargain with the Kazekage was extremely dangerous, Naruto knew, but he'd need to do it. He'd have to shoulder the burden of the consequences, as well. It was good that he had sturdy shoulders. Naruto knew that the Kazekage didn't love his son. It wasn't until his resurrection in the Fourth Shinobi World War that he'd learned of the great things that his son was capable of, or so Gaara had related to him. Only then had he shown a hint of compassion. Right now, getting the boy to Konoha was possible, because the man saw no value in his son. Perhaps, this time, reconciliation would be possible without either side being dead. The Kazekage muttered something under his breath, shoulders slumping. Very well, then. Gaara will go to Konoha, but only for a year. After that, he shall choose to abandon his home village entirely, or return. That, and distancing myself from Oto, is what I can give in exchange for the continued alliance. Naruto nodded. Then we are agreed. Where is the boy? The Kazekage looked away. Find him yourself. I wash my hands of this whole affair. The man turned away and opened the door, leaving without a backwards glance. What a cold person, Naruto muttered, wandering out of the Kazekage's building with a deep frown. This wasn't going to end well. The Kazekage would not so easily get rid of a Jinchuriki. It had been an opening shot, a bargaining chip. He hadn't expected the Kazekage to immediately accept. More likely than the man being compliant was that he saw it as an opportunity to have the Aikibi in Konoha, without needing the Chunin exams as an excuse. Perhaps he still intended to invade Konoha on his own, or betray him as well, and maintain the agreements with Oto. What he needed, now, was the sensible Gaara. Without him, the Suna invasion plans would collapse. Without him, any clever trickery the Suna leader had invented would be pointless. He rubbed his temples and groaned. Another shadow clone had popped, back in Konoha. He was running out, and the last few had been decidedly odd, in terms of memories. That wasn't really new. He'd spent 10 days away, once, leaving a legion of shadow clones behind, and by the 8th they'd decided to make a giant human pyramid in the middle of town. He was running out of time, and Kakashi was getting suspicious of the increasingly erratic Naruto. Before he went back, though, he needed to fetch Gaara without getting crushed, and he needed to find one other citizen of Suna. Somewhere between his arrival and now, he'd gone insane. Naruto had concluded as much shortly after reaching the walls of Suna, barely capable of holding in a laugh at his successful ruse. Infiltrating the hidden village and manipulating the Kazekage were completely nutty ideas, and he'd pulled them off. Even now, dozens of carefully concealed clones were ransacking the place for anything that might be of use. If they got caught, they could simply pop out. Thus far, not one of them had caught a trace of Gaara. It seemed like he wasn't in the village at all. That only left the desert. Then, he knew from the older version of Gaara that was a place he'd often go to be alone, to avoid the people. Knowing enough about the situation had certainly helped, as his foreknowledge of the invasion plans had definitely surprised Gaara's father enough to get away with some pretty significant demands. Many things could have gone wrong. Could still go wrong. Changing time itself was risky business, and he'd basically been driving a Rasengan into history and hoping that it turned out okay. He conceded that he probably wasn't the best choice to be handling something as delicate as this, but he couldn't really look back now. He'd have to figure out a way to find Gaara, and convince him to go without alerting half the village. Trying to find Gaara couldn't be terribly difficult. He was a Jinchuriki with flimsy control of his Biju at best, which meant a lot of nasty chakra would be emanating from the boy. It was strange to think of Gaara as a boy, despite technically being about the same age, now. He was so used to the adult version. Naruto fished the second scroll he'd taken from Konoha out of his pocket and studied it for a long moment. His hidden weapon. Staring out over the desert sands, he wondered what he was doing. This was Gaara's preferred element, after all. The sand was everywhere. On the flip side, that meant even the guards would be unlikely to venture out here, for fear of being slain. Naruto flinched as a whiff of unmistakably monstrous chakra set his teeth on edge, far closer than he'd anticipated, though still well outside the village. He shivered as he stared in the direction it had come from. That had been demonic chakra, no doubt about it, Gaara's chakra. The sands shifted, and for a brief moment he thought that it would crush him right then. Naruto had the presence of mind to check his surroundings, but there was rather little to hide behind. He cleared his throat. Gaara of the desert. The vast billowing clouds slowly moved aside, seemingly out of sight, but Naruto was well aware that Gaara was surrounding him. That was a favored tactic of his, after all. Thankfully, this particular move would no longer work on him, now that he knew the Rasengan. He'd blast right out of the prison before it could properly form. Have you come to try and end my existence? The voice was ragged and sharp. Naruto winced at the erratic tone, too. This was Gaara before. He had to remember that. Gaara of the desert. I come from the Yondaime cage, Naruto started, hesitating as he remembered the poor relationship that father and son had, at least in this time. He has agreed to let you spend a year in another location, in my hometown. It is already done, we have to leave immediately. The red-haired boy scoffed, the sand now churning below his feet, and tendrils of swirling sand rose up from the soil. Naruto forced himself to stand his ground. Finally, the boy spoke again. So, father sent you. Did he want you to me, too? His voice suddenly had a rough quality to it, and Naruto wondered what he was getting himself into. He hadn't come here to fight Shukaku again. Gaara narrowed his eyes. I will not let you end my existence. I haven't come to you, Naruto explained, but Gaara didn't react. Suddenly he approached. A vicious smile stretched across his face as his sand poured closer from all directions. Crap. Without rules or regulations in place to limit him, Gaara had few reasons to suppress the Ikibi. Naruto needed to remember to get in contact with Kankuro and Temari as soon as this mess was cleared up. He sighed. You know, I really didn't want it to come to this. We've barely even met. I don't know you. You mean to me, all that come here want to, Gaara said. To live I must and you are my prey. Naruto shook his head as Gaara's sand suddenly shot forward. 3 clones popped into existence, throwing themselves at Gaara while the real Naruto backed away. Gaara, I don't want to you, or hurt you. Calm down. Don't let it control your mind. He grunted as the sand crushed one of his clones, and he gained its uncomfortable memories. If you don't control it, I'll have to get serious. He wiped a lock of white hair out of his face, getting ready to evade the sand once more. Gaara glared madly at him, Shukaku lurking barely below the surface, now. The creature's demonic chakra inundated the air, and the Kyuubi sensed it. He knew, the seal on his stomach seared painfully as the Biju attempted to infuse demonic chakra into him, to keep him alive against this kind of foe. The fact that he wasn't currently enraged was the only reason it hadn't taken control as it had that first time, on the bridge in Wave. Well, this was going to get messy. Naruto took a firm hold of his emergency scroll and yanked it open. This was one of the few seals he hadn't designed himself. It was too far beyond his skills, even now. He'd copied from Pervy Sage's notes, years after the man had passed away in the fight against Nagato. It was also one of the few seals he'd actually memorized, at least of this complexity. Fūinjutsu, he tried as he began to pour chakra into the seal, but Gaara crashed through his clones, approaching with unrestrained madness as the desert came alive around him. Naruto had to defend himself, interrupting the process. Shukaku wasn't going to give him the time he needed to place the seal. It instinctively knew what he was attempting, it seemed. Gaara didn't normally move in a fight. His whole style was designed to take advantage of his ultimate sand defense. He was already using his arms to cover his chest, blocking off the seal that held the tailed beast in its container. Calling on the Kyuubi's chakra would be a bad idea. Suna's sentries were doubtlessly used to the Aikibi's emanations, but adding another demon, a worse one, would attract a lot of attention. That was assuming there were no Anbu around from Suna, which he expected was the case. Still, that wasn't the only option he had. Raising his hand, a glowing blue ball of chakra spun into existence. Calling the Council of Clones to order. It had become something of a habit. Over the last few days, a varied collection of shadow clones sat, stood, or hung around the apartment, most of them uninterested in what was going on. Getting together to discuss how to deal with serving as the real Naruto's decoys, the clones had quickly agreed that the sanest of them should be the one to call things to order, though that was relative. None of them were unaffected by their unusually long existence. One of the clones coughed. Is it me or are there fewer of us? Well, we had to pop 6 just because they got up to hair-brained schemes. Well, more so than usual, another answered. That certainly didn't help. Then there was that ramen hunt, of course. How many of us are left, anyway? 24. Damn it, people, we're running out of me. Another clone exclaimed. At the weird looks he received from the others, he rolled his eyes. We're getting awfully close to 0. How are we going to stick around until the boss returns? We probably only have a day or 2 to go, the first clone argued, lounging lazily against the wall. We could tell Kakashi-sensei that we're sick. It'd be less troublesome than actually doing missions. I'm sure 1 or 2 days wouldn't hurt. The second clone stared. When did you turn into Shikamaru? It's creepy. The clone just snorted, looking away. Damn it. Now we've got a Naruto who's obsessed with the Nara. That's just not natural. Half of us are going loopy now that we're unraveling on the edges, and even the ones with the most chakra don't have enough for 2 days, not without regenerating it, too. We need a solution. We're even running out of scrolls. I'd suggest we moderate our chakra usage, that way we might be able to last. Keep the last scrolls just in case. There are emergency plan. That counts for you too, seal nerds. The 2 blinked as they looked up from their scrolls. What were you saying? The oldest clone groaned, just as there was a knock on the door. Naruto, are you at home? All of the replicas froze. They all knew what this meant. Kakashi-sensei was at the door. Not good. Definitely not good. I'm here, Kakashi-sensei, yelled the youngest clone, who had already spent the better part of the day with Team 7. I'll be right out. Can I come in? It's a mess. Don't worry about it. I'll be right out. The clone stumbled to the door, evading several of its brethren as they quickly dove behind couches, into the kitchen, or right out the window. Soon, the room seemed empty, even if several of the clones were rather poorly concealed. Opening the door gingerly, the remaining Naruto clones stared out uncertainly. Kakashi looked, In a word, awful. Not only were his clothes in disarray and blood spattered, but he was missing an entire sleeve. Is something wrong? Naruto knew for sure that Kakashi had never come to his door like this, not the last time around. What's with the blood? Kakashi grimaced. There's been an attack. Sasuke's been injured. Naruto's breath hitched. For a long moment he could have sworn his heart stopped beating. He barely managed to avoid the next wave of sand and smashed a Rasengan squarely into the wave after that, dispersing it. What? He blurted. Gaara didn't say anything, a wicked smile on his face as he approached again, doubtlessly under the Aikibi's influence. Naruto avoided getting too close, too wrapped up in thought to think of something to say. Something was wrong, very wrong, in Konoha. Naruto had just received the memories from one of his remaining shadow clones, and they hadn't been pretty. Kakashi was hurt, and so was Sasuke. The Jonin hadn't told the clone anything about what happened, though. Naruto felt a chill run down his back as he considered that. He was certain that at this point in time nothing like an attack on the Uchiha should have happened, which meant that something he did must have triggered it. Had Itachi come back early, for his screwed-up idea of a lesson? Toby, perhaps. Damn, the nasty changes were already taking effect. He had to get back home. I'm sorry, it seems we can't stick around, Naruto said to Gaara. His speed wasn't brilliant, but it should allow him to actually reach the boy, rather than just avoid him, if only once. If he missed, it could be bad. Well, he still had his Rasengan, just in case. He held his scroll before him as he dashed ahead, gritting his teeth against the pain in his gut. The Kyuubi was incensed by what he was doing instead of using its chakra to pound the other Biju into the ground. Well, it was good he was in control, then. He smashed Gaara's arms aside, focusing his chakra to active his seal. Fūinjutsu. Gogyo Fuin. The five-element seal was an old trick that had first been used on him by Orochimaru during the Chunin exams. It had knocked him right out, and for a time yet the seal had messed up his chakra, too. He had also been incapable of channeling the Kyuubi's special form of chakra. As a side effect, though, he'd not been in mental contact with it, either. Perfect. Used on a normal person, the seal might well put them in a coma, or even them. Chakra was vital to life, after all. On a Jinchuriki, Naruto figured he was a living example that it actually worked. Smashing his hand with the scroll against Gaara's chest, Naruto grimaced. The boy's eyes widened, and the blood-crazed rage briefly making way for sheer terror, until the seal burst to life, sizzling under his fingers. Gaara slumped to the ground, sand slipping off him on all directions in streams as his perfect defense crumbled away. Instantaneous unconsciousness. There was a reason he'd learned this move, and ways to block it. There were few who could apply it, true, but even one was too many. In the end, he'd only have to use his defense once, but it had saved his life. That was mere hours before he'd gone back. He had no longer been a Jinchuriki at the time. It would have been even more dangerous than usual, had he been hit. It was a cruel solution, really. Besides taking away Gaara's access to the Aikibi and its maddening voice, the five-element seal would probably also remove his sand shield, perhaps his entire ability to control sand. Granted, he didn't intend it to be a final answer to the problem of the Biju, but it would take time to develop a fix for the Fūinjutsu that was holding it back, even with his father's notes, or his own. Naruto crouched down next to Gaara, checking if everything was alright with the seal. It was even numbered, even if it only had 2 parts rather than 8, no surprise that it was so weak, then. He'd have to remember to transcribe it in its entirety, as soon as he could. If he was going to do anything more helpful than knocking Gaara unconscious, he'd have to. Halt. Naruto turned, frowning. Anbu-san, have you not been informed of the agreement with Keisuke-sama yet? The man paused for a moment. I have. I did not expect you to take him like that. He'll resent the treatment. That is my concern, not yours, Naruto said, shrugging. I promise I won't harm him any more than I already have. Tell him that when you see the cage. Raising his hands into the familiar hand sign, Naruto called another small legion of shadow clones. We're heading home. Half of you should stay behind and get some of Gaara's stuff. You know what I mean. I'm taking him to that place. You know the one. Bring everything there. Will do, boss. Naruto grumbled a goodbye, raising Gaara from the ground as the Anbu looked on apprehensively. The boy was incredibly light for his size. It was probably the sand that made him such an immovable object. Quickly Naruto was speeding back towards Konoha, cutting straight through the desert. His second planned visit in Suna needed to wait, it seemed. It didn't really matter. It would be years before anything would happen that might get in the way. Now, he had to get to a safe haven, to keep Gaara from prying eyes. He couldn't very well walk into Konoha with him, after all. There was one he knew of, that could serve his purposes, a safe house discovered in the wake of the Fourth Shinobi World War. One of the safe houses that the Yellow Flash used during his time as Hokage, to detain particularly high-profile individuals. There were only 2 ways in, and neither had requirements that were easily fulfilled. After that, he needed to do one other thing, find Jiraiya. If he was going to pull this ruse and convince the cage that his agreement still held, then he'd need the Sannin to play his part. How he was going to make that happen he didn't know, but he wasn't Konoha's most surprising ninja for nothing. He smiled devilishly as he stepped it up another notch. Naruto, can't you sit still for 1 minute? Sakura-chan, the clone pouted, twitching slightly as Kakashi jumped down to join them. Kakashi-sensei, do you know who attacked Sasuke yet? Kakashi looked away. That's classified information, Naruto. You should know that. You were there when the Hokage told you as much. The clone grumbled. Someone assaulted one of my team members. Of course I'm going to want to know who did it. I'll beat them up in return. He shook his head tiredly. At least tell me he's going to be out of the hospital soon. It's weird not having him around on missions, even if they're just D-rank ones. The last few days had been hectic. He was one of the last 3 clones, all of which had been sustaining themselves via senjutsu. That particular tactic hadn't occurred to them until they were already running on fumes, much to their mutual irritation. It required them to spend hours upon hours each day just meditating, otherwise they'd just pop. Still, like the clones that Naruto had left behind at Mount Myoboku when fighting Nagato and other foes, they were able to last quite a while longer this way. That said, senjutsu was volatile, so they didn't dare take in too much. They had no idea what would happen to the real Naruto if he suddenly received a large amount of senjutsu chakra without having signed the Toad contract, or trained his body again to be able to attain Sage Mode. Becoming a Toad statue was definitely not in the plan. The clones' attention hadn't really been on that particular issue, anyway. The attack on Sasuke had been a strange moment. For the entire duration of the trip to the hospital, the clones had been convinced that someone stole his eyes, but when he arrived, Sasuke's face was just fine. Either the attackers hadn't been after the Sharingan, or they had been after something. The only thing he'd been able to drag out of Kakashi was that the attacker was a man, and not from Konoha. Sasuke would remain under observation for a few more days. He'd broken several bones, and even with healing supplied by medical ninjas, it would take some time before the Uchiha would be doing anything too intense. Sakura and Ino in particular had spent far too much time at his bedside, and Naruto thought he saw something almost like relief on Sasuke's face whenever he visited. Well, At least he wasn't hated, then. Kakashi, whatever his role in the whole thing had been, returned to normal very swiftly, bossing his other genin around while spending entirely too much time reading porn novels. He'd been sending curious glances at Naruto, though, the clone wasn't entirely sure what had caught the man's interest, but he'd found himself under the scrutiny of the Sharingan at least twice, though the Jonin would not say why he thought that necessary. Thankfully, it would soon not be his problem anymore. The real Naruto could take over. The clone turned to Kakashi and frowned. So, when is Sasuke getting out? Kakashi sighed. As soon as his bones and muscles have healed, he'll be back on missions, Naruto. I was under the impression that you two could barely tolerate each other. Naruto looked away, frowning. He couldn't really tell the truth about any of that. His history with the last Uchiha, well, not anymore, in this time, had always been hard to pin down. He supposed that ever since that fight in the valley, where he'd been skewered by Chidori, he and Sasuke had been enemies. He didn't know if that was really what he should call it, though. At the end of the Fourth Shinobi World War, they'd met again, and that time it had been to the death. He didn't want that to happen again. He didn't want Sasuke to throw his life away for the same lies, manipulated by everyone from Orochimaru to Itachi until he hadn't known what was real anymore, and what was mere nonsense. Then he'd died, and he'd never gotten his answers. Well, screw that, I'll keep my promise, he murmured. Sakura looked up and blinked owlishly. Naruto smiled slightly. Don't worry about it, it's just a personal promise. As long as it doesn't involve Sasuke-kun, she answered. Sakura? Naruto hesitated. Do you want to train with me? At least until Sasuke is back. He smiled slightly. You picked up that first genjutsu really quickly, and I've always been. I mean, I'm really bad at those. Her eyes softened slightly, and she nodded. Huh, had it always been this easy? Naruto smiled, trying not to think of the thousand things that were still churning around his head. Thousands of questions. Who had attacked Sasuke? What had he done to trigger it? Was the only one that went back here, to the past? Gaara blinked awake slowly, his eyes roving confusedly around the dimly lit room. His eyes were crusty, his throat was dry, and there was an unusual chill in the air that he wasn't used to. For a few more moments he failed to connect what he saw to what he remembered. Then finally, it connected. Paralyzing fear was the first thing he felt as he stared around, realizing that he'd just been sleeping. He'd been sleeping. He didn't do that. He couldn't. He'd been living without that luxury for longer than he could remember, only ever given a brief respite when Mother went wild. What had happened? Where was Mother's voice? He tried to move, but he could only wiggle back and forth slightly, his muscles cramped and he stopped. That feeling was unfamiliar. Dull and uncomfortable. It had to be pain of some sort. He'd been scraping his wrists against something, and it hurt. His sand, his perfect defense, was gone. He let out a blood-curdling cry as he tried to wrestle free with increased fervor, realizing that he was tied up. A rope was wrapped around him nearly from head to toe, and he was strapped to a large, soft chair. The only light he could see came from high above, a small alcove that led in the air and a thin ray of sunlight. No need to make a fuss, I'm right here, a voice said from deeper in the room. A boy stepped forward from the gloom, barely older than Gaara was, it seemed, with bright blonde hair and strange whisker-like marks on his cheeks. The boy smiled congenially. Gaara, our first meeting was a bit more unfriendly than I'd figured, so I'm sorry I had to do this. Where? Gaara looked around the room with narrowed eyes, trying madly to find a way out. The room looked long abandoned, with spider webs crisscrossing in the corners, a handful of ratty robes and cloaks hang from the walls, as well as enough kunai for a small army. Who are you? Where's the white-haired man? He grimaced as his head ached, but for a different reason than usual. What did you do to mother? Let me out. He struggled and the pain reminded him how exposed he was. Let me out. Ah, Gaara, the boy said, shaking his head. His tone seemed almost wistful. This place we're in, well, it belonged to my father, when he was still alive. We're in the land of fire, some distance from Konoha, if you must know. Technically this particular safe house is unknown to the village, which is why I figured it was a handy place to put you. As for your mother, the Ikibi is, nor ever was, your mother. I shut it up for a while. I figured you could use the peace of mind, so could I, for that matter. The silence in his thoughts was deafening, frightening. Gaara continued to wrestle against his bonds but they didn't budge, and the boy only stared at him with a strange look in his eyes. An impulse to slaughter this kidnapping Konoha ninja occurred to him but vanished as quickly. He had no control over his sand, and he was tied up, he was at the boy's mercy. For the first time in a long, long time, he was vulnerable. Let me go. You won't end my existence. Naruto shook his head mildly. I already told you, when we first met that's not what I came for. It's true what I said, an arrangement was made with your father to take you to Konoha. He told me to find you myself. As you realize by now, that's precisely what I did. I was the white-haired man. Naruto paused for a long time, simply staring, as Gaara breathed heavily, desperately trying to find a way free, though finding none. Finally, he spoke again. The reason I brought you here is simple. We're the same. The boy was delusional, then, as well as a kidnapper. You are nothing like me. His gaze danced around the room, pausing on the strange kunai lined up against the wall, on the distant little window. He'd been taken away from Suna. He'd been taken, and mother was stolen from him. A deep loathing for the boy that stood before him formed in that instant. Let me go, or I'll you and feed your blood to my sand. Gaara. The boy paused, frowning. I know that you live foring, that you chose to see murder as the validation of your existence. You've told me as much. I hope that I can show you a better way. A more effective way to get what you want. Your method is not the only way to gain respect or awe, and it's certainly not the only means of validating your own worth. Don't speak as if you know me. Gaara spat. He wanted to turn away, but he couldn't. The blond boy didn't divert his sharp gaze. Oh, but I do know you. He said, and smiled, placing a hand on Gaara's chest. You are Gaara of the desert, son of the fourth Kazekage, sibling and teammate of Kankuro and Tamari. Jinchuriki of the one-tailed beast, Shukaku. You are also lonely. He smiled softly. Don't talk to me about loneliness, Gaara said lowly. You stole me from my village. I think I can speak from experience about loneliness. You can still be lonely even in the busiest of places, Naruto said. It's nice to meet you, Gaara. Let me introduce myself properly, then. I am Naruto of the Leaf, son of the fourth Hokage, teammate of Sasuke and Sakura. Jinchuriki of the nine-tailed beast, Kurama. And, I have found my place. Son of, you are a Jinchuriki, Gaara gaped. Naruto nodded sagely. You are not the only one, you know. There are others who carry a burden like your own. Who have been shunned or alienated by their people. Some separate themselves from everyone, despising the common shinobi, while some are honored. He tapped Gaara on the head. Some are like us, a lonely reminder of what gruesome events happened in the previous generation. The living embodiments of a sacrifice. We both lost parents, the day we were born. Gaara stared with glassy eyes as Naruto turned and walked back into the darkness. Gaara tried again to break free, terror settling in his gut as he imagined being torn to shreds by the nine tails. He'd have to be quicker, then, taking down the other host first. It's not true. Monsters do not have a place. People cannot win against their loneliness. Naruto shrugged. There are many in my village who still despise me, who see me as little more than the demon that's locked in my gut. There are others, though. People who care, who respect me. My team, for one, and the Hokage. You have such people as well. Kankuro and Tamari fear you, that is true, but they haven't run away, have they? Despite the fear that Shukaku might lash out, they chose to get close to you anyway. You're their brother, after all. Gaara scoffed. Naruto shook his head, smiling slightly. You don't understand right now. You've barely realized how different it is to live without that voice in your head, you're still panicking. I have it on very good authority that your thinking processes should be much clearer now, with less effort to maintain that level. Perhaps this time you will find out on your own what the beast has been hiding from you. The true way to happiness. He shrugged. I hope to have a way to fix your seal within a few weeks, perhaps months. Then, you can shut it off or let it in at will, rather than let the creature control your life. You mean to keep me here? Gaara asked, a hint of panic in his voice. No, no, I'm afraid you'll have to stay out of sight, for now. I'll leave clones behind, or stay here myself as often as I can. Freeing you from your captive state, even if you do not see it as such at this time, was something I'd promised a dear friend. I mean to help you become a better shinobi, and a better person, without adding to your pain and misery. You're not a bad person, Gaara, even with all the deeds you've done. No more, though. He shook his head. Perhaps, when you no longer wish to me, we can discuss a way for you to enter the village of Konoha. I believe you would enjoy it. Gaara didn't answer, simply staring mutely. I've got a year, per agreement. Gaara closed his eyes, trying to control his warring thoughts. They were simultaneously clearer and murkier. He missed the crystal clear clarity of a single goal, to end a threat to his existence. That voice was hidden now behind a great mess of hopes and dreams and fears that he'd long forgotten. The boy was like him and yet he wasn't. He would be a test of his abilities, a test of his worth, and yet Gaara was fairly sure the boy would not him, if it should come to a fight. Above it all, he hated being confined, being hurt. This bunker's keyed to blood, only those with the right kind can enter, Naruto informed him. It's pretty large, and impenetrable. I certainly haven't found a way yet. Probably something to do with the construction. Anyway, the way in is usually via teleportation jutsu, so aside from the one emergency exit that I used, I'm not aware of any proper entrances. That means that unless I let you out, you're pretty stuck here. Figured you should know. He gestured behind him to the table. There's enough food and water there to last for weeks, and I can always bring more. There's a library 2 rooms over, though I haven't had the time to go through most of the books there. You might find unsavory material. This is my cell. Gaara snapped, glaring at Naruto with undisguised loathing. Yes. Well, until I'm certain that you're not going to murder everyone you come across, Naruto said dubiously. Without Shukaku and the sand it should be pretty safe, but you showing up anywhere with that seal on you is going to invoke a ton of questions that I don't want to answer. All you, and escape with your blood, Gaara announced. He was gratified to notice that Naruto faltered for a moment, but his smile wouldn't go away. What would it take? Well, if you're strong enough to do that, go ahead, Naruto said, smirking. There are a couple other rooms. There's a washing room somewhere, and I'm pretty sure there's even a sparring chamber. The whole place is a bit run down though, it's been 10 years since anyone used it. He formed a hand seal and more than 30 shadow clones popped into existence directly behind him, staring around in dismay. Oi, you want us to do all this? It's going to take forever. Don't whine, Naruto said, rolling his eyes. I have to get back to town. Sasuke's in the hospital. I still have to figure that out, and I think there's only one clone left, back there. So, how long are we supposed to last? Because I don't want to go insane, one of the clones said, frowning. Do you want us to use that method? The one that the other clones came up with? Naruto shrugged. Figure it out amongst yourselves. I suppose the senjutsu trick will work. I hadn't thought about it, actually. I haven't really needed long-term clones before, so I'm not sure what works best. I'll know when you're running out anyway, so I can always come by or send new clones this way. He frowned. You know, right about now that technique of Dad's would be really helpful. Even with clones, I'm limited in the number of places I can be. Gaara slumped in his restraints, his panic making way for a plan. It seemed he'd be biding his time for a while. It didn't look like the other Jinchuriki was going to make it easy for him. Firstly, he'd have to test that blood protection. Naruto could have simply lied. People did that a lot, in his experience. Then, there was the window. It was small and high up, but it definitely showed sunlight. Perhaps that was a good way out. He grinned viciously as he glared at his captor. This would all be over soon. The last Naruto clone in Konoha found himself regularly looking out over the village, worrying about his creator's whereabouts. His chakra was running low, like all the others. Even with the huge amounts used to create them, the whole construct could only last so long, and pouring in more wouldn't help. Senjutsu was a good way to remain stable for a longer period, but it was certainly not enough to keep him going indefinitely, not unless he gathered the energy constantly. He'd visited Sasuke again. He'd still not gotten any details of what happened, and he was getting mildly annoyed by it. It was true that their team was new, at least this time around, and that the two of them had rather hated each other in the academy. That shouldn't matter. If someone was going around attacking his teammates, he'd have to do something about it. Of course, the real problem here wasn't that someone attacked Sasuke. Perhaps he'd even have been mildly amused by the great Uchiha being kicked down a notch, in his previous life. This time, though, time had shifted. He knew for certain that whatever happened had been his own doing. No, he didn't feel guilty about it. He'd had no way of predicting it, after all, and he'd done what he felt was right. He did feel that he needed to step it up, though. He needed to get better, quicker. If his changes were already affecting things enough that something of this magnitude had altered, then it had snowballed a lot quicker than he'd anticipated. It could be an isolated event, of course, but that was hardly an assumption he could safely make. The other option was too terrible to contemplate. There were many people who would have wished Sasuke harm, or required something from him. Most of them hadn't yet shown up near Konoha. In his original timeline, Orochimaru was the closest. He was quite sure he hadn't sent any of them closer to Konoha with his activity so far. Which left the possibility of another traveler. Someone who'd followed him through. There were precious few people who could or would have, that also wished Sasuke harm. None of them were good news. Yo. The clone blinked, glancing up. Kakashi-sensei. Kakashi smiled as he dropped down and stepped into Naruto's apartment. He looked around for a moment, perhaps amazed by how clean the place was, after one of the clones had gotten obsessed with making sure the place was tidy. Any reason you're here? Kakashi turned and shrugged. Well, that depends, really. Where is the real Naruto? The clone froze. What do you mean, Kakashi-sensei? I'm not real. He glanced down and frowned. What are you talking about? Come now, even the real one's a better actor. I'll have you know I'm exactly as good an actor as. He paused. Crap. When did you find out? I admit, it took a while. Ultimately, it was your erratic behavior that tipped me off. He smirked. The clones were destabilizing, weren't they? That's why all the pranks started again so suddenly. So, Naruto clone, if you and your brethren have been the ones showing up at missions and training, where is the real one? He shook his head. I suppose from now on, I'll have to remember to give him a good hit over the head when he arrives. I'll have to dock it from his pay, too. Shirking one's duties as a shinobi can be considered a crime. Not for Genin, the clone argued, and Kakashi raised an eyebrow. Reading the regulations, now. You have been busy, haven't you? So, what's the real one doing? Making the seals that you clones have been bringing along. Just invading foreign countries and kidnapping people, I'm sure, the clone answered jovially. How would I know? I'm a clone. I was just put here to play decoy. It worked pretty well, until now, he grumbled as he turned around. Would you mind not popping me until he gets back? I was in the middle of a pretty good book. Kakashi shrugged. So, where exactly is Naruto now? Naruto rubbed his face tiredly, trying to keep alert. He'd gone without sleep for several days now, and it was starting to take a toll. After dragging Gaara, light as he was, all the way from Suna to the Fourth's hideout, he had still needed to travel for over an hour before the great Hokage monument finally came into view. He hoped that his clones could hold the fort for a bit with Gaara, since he didn't have any easy way of getting back there, especially if a C-rank mission was coming up, as had been the case with the mission to Wave in his original time. He adjusted the scrolls on his back, most of which he'd taken from the very base he'd just left. The library there hadn't contained much, but it was probably best to remove the volatile stuff from Gaara's reach, and perhaps he could do something with it. On the inside of this jacket he'd put one of his father's Hiraishin kunai. He never thought of himself as overly sentimental, but it felt right to carry a memento. He also wanted to figure out the seal, of course, that was just common sense. Subscribing to anime streaming services. It was strange, Naruto reflected, that the village would probably never know what he'd prevented with his ruse in Suna, that some people would never realize that they would have died if he hadn't stepped in. Without the Kage's forces, Orochimaru couldn't hope to successfully invade Konoha on his own. That left the Sannin with only a few options to his goals. An assassination attempt on the Hokage was not unreasonable, but with all the Anbu forces around the leader of any village, that would be quite difficult. It was probably due to the Kage's arrogance that Orochimaru ever got the drop on him. Of course, since the Hokage would soon know about the snake's plans, that scenario would get even more unlikely. Setting it up so that both the Kage and Jiraiya were under the impression they'd been approached by the other had been risky, but they didn't see each other enough to see through it easily. Naruto knew that Jiraiya, at least, would talk his way out of the situation if he figured it out, especially if it was to the village's advantage. Naruto's letter had made it explicit that the Kage wished to stay out of the picture, which should help in ensuring that Jiraiya remained unaware of the full picture, at least for a while yet. After the Chunin exams it didn't matter as much, and the first time the Kage and the Toad Sage were liable to meet was during the last stage of the same event. Perfect. Naruto still had some things to iron out in the coming days. His clone hadn't needed to travel very far to find Jiraiya, which meant he was nearby. The letter he delivered probably spurred him on to go faster, which meant the man could arrive at any moment. He'd need to remember to stick to town. Sending a new army of clones to Gaara's position would have to be it for the moment, so they could take over from the old ones. Returning personally would be a bit risky. Still, his clones were him, so they wouldn't do anything too insane. Hopefully. One thing he needed to take care of back here in Konoha would be to figure out what happened to Sasuke. He needed to know what cascade he had set off that led to that particular event. It was probably not related to what he'd gotten up to in Suna, that would have far-reaching consequences in time, but it was still too recent. Gato. The old bastard didn't even really know about Sasuke until they met on the bridge, and never showed much interest, which ruled that out. Zabuza and Haku had equally little to do with the Uchiha. That really only left Mizuki, and that seemed even more unlikely. Naruto had considered Orochimaru before, but that man certainly hadn't had the time to come down from Oto and infiltrate the village, if he'd even learned of the Kazecage's defection yet. It didn't make any sense. Naruto strode towards his apartment with a resigned sigh, leaving complex planning to a time when he could actually form coherent thoughts again. Sleep deprivation wasn't helping him, and he was liable to do things he shouldn't when he was like this. Naruto realized he'd almost dozed off on his feet when his path was blocked quite suddenly, something that hadn't happened to him in ages, not even in the young boy. He stumbled and blinked in surprise as he realized who it was. Kakashi-sensei stood before him with his hands in his pockets and an annoyed expression. So, there you are. Naruto stared worriedly as he realized that there were only a handful of reasons that could explain why Kakashi would be angry at him. Perhaps his clones had done some massive prank, in which case he'd need to buy them some ramen, or one of them had spilled the beans on being clones. Knowing his luck, it was the latter. He turned away, feeling suddenly ashamed. He supposed he was just thinking of Kakashi as Hokage again, and he did respect that position beyond any other, despite his rather light-hearted way of addressing anyone who held the position. "Ho Kakashi-sensei," Naruto said, sighing. He really needed to sleep, damn it. "You look terrible," Kakashi commented, worry creeping into his voice. Naruto winced as he rubbed his tired muscles and forced himself to stay alert. "I feel like I've run back and forth to Suna," he muttered finally, gesturing ahead. "Can we do this in my apartment? I could use a soft chair or a bed, or anything." Kakashi nodded mutely, keeping the same slow pace as Naruto as the two walked from street to street. The man kept sending glances at his student. Clearly the man had figured out about the clones. Naruto didn't remember being unmasked, which meant that this was a recent development. At least that gave him something to work with. It was a setback more in gaining Kakashi's trust than in actually being prevented from changing things, but he considered that important anyway. Though, he supposed he shouldn't whine. He had essentially committed treason by conspiring with the Kazekage, and having Kakashi cross with him was a rather small repercussion, really. Arriving at his apartment at last, Naruto didn't bother with the stairs, strolling up the wall and collapsing on his bench with a heartfelt sigh. The last clone waved at him tiredly and immediately popped. For a brief moment the real Naruto saw double, as if two different people were trying to use the same eyes. A week's worth of information slammed into his brain, much of it colored by an increasingly annoying focus on irrelevant activities and ramen. Insane clones were not doing his psyche any favors, that much was clear, and he really needed to figure out a way to avoid this in the future. Well, at least his clones had mostly avoided doing embarrassing things. This clone had spent an inordinate amount of time at the hot springs, he realized. Ostensibly to keep an eye out for Jiraiya, but not really. He smiled slightly as he recalled his travels with the Toad Sage, and the many, many baths the man used for his research. Kakashi entered and Naruto forced himself to concentrate on the now. He'd be able to see the old pervert again soon enough. "Didn't you already go over this with a clone?" Naruto whined, rubbing his face. "The shadow clone technique works like that, you know. I get all their memories, all their experiences. I know every D-rank mission we've been to, everything I said to you, and so on. I also know I'm in trouble, no need to rub it in." Kakashi shook his head. What could be so important that you left your genin team with a shadow clone and took off? Naruto frowned. He'd need a good excuse to satisfy Kakashi and inevitably the Hokage, and there weren't very many that would actually work. To the Kage he was a stranger, and much the same for Jiraiya. Though it was true that he'd changed since he was really this age, he had no doubt that an outrageous lie would be caught by the Hokage, no matter how convincingly he argued it was true. The man wasn't called the god of shinobi for nothing. Naruto had considered a few options on his way here, just in case, but now that it came down to it, he was unsure. Claiming he went out to train would just make Kakashi suspicious, considering he was supposed to be the one doing the teaching, and they hadn't really done much in the way of training. Sealing could work, but his clones hadn't gotten much further than a day or two of work, which wouldn't cut it. There was, however, another option, one that would probably cause a lot of trouble, but would definitely divert attention away from the specifics. He'd probably never have considered using that as an excuse, but why the hell not? He'd never avoided trouble before. Kakashi-sensei, you know the secret regarding me, right? Beyond just my father. Kakashi gazed with wide eyes at him, and then looked away, pained. You know about that too, then. You're honestly surprised about that? Naruto wondered. I knew about Dad, I work with seals constantly, and you think I couldn't put two and two together? Of course I know about it. He rubbed a hand over his stomach and grimaced. The Kyuubi, the creature locked within me. Yes, I know about it, and I have for some time. I didn't want to deal with this whole issue in the village for obvious reasons, and it wasn't like anyone could help. I spoke with it, Naruto answered simply, and waited for the reprimand. He hadn't really spoken to Kurama, the nine-tailed fox. Not because he didn't want to, but because the fox was presently still the vicious bastard he'd originally known him as, before the Fourth Shinobi World War. Yes, he could restate what he'd already promised to this new Kyuubi, but he didn't know if that would change much. It was doubtful he'd be taken seriously, and Madara wasn't around to convince him to lend power. Last time around he'd beaten up Kurama with the help of his mother to get its chakra, and it wasn't until later that he and the fox had come to some agreement. Naruto didn't have the power now to repeat that particular trick, not by a long way. He'd need the Toad contract back, at least, so he could once more use Senjutsu effectively, and he'd need to get his nastier Rasengan varieties back. Subscribing to anime streaming services. The Kyuubi was just a beast, as far as anyone knew, too. He could use that particular belief. He turned to Kakashi with a frown. He needed to get this across right. Kakashi-sensei, I know what I'm doing. I'm the only one that it wouldn't hurt, since I am the one that keeps it alive. The seal that the fourth made is not just a prison, you know. It's a tool. It's designed to allow the host to use the special chakra that the Biju has, for whatever purpose they see fit. I can't do anything like that near the village, of course. The villagers would me if they found out it's even possible, and the shinobi. How long have you been doing this? Using the creature's chakra? Kakashi asked sharply. Do you know how dangerous something like that is? Naruto frowned, trying to look sad, though he was annoyed more than anything. Nobody even noticed, sensei. The only reason you did so now was because someone actually paid attention to where I was, so I had to send in clones. He sighed tiredly. Whenever I do that kind of thing I surround myself with seals that will send me unconscious if I trip them. I can only disarm them when I'm sensible. The Kyuubi's chakra immediately dissipates if I pass those without doing so. I'm not stupid. Kakashi shook his head, glaring. How could you do this without even informing the Hokage? Naruto realized that the man was on the verge of actually yelling at him, which was rather a rarity. It's not the Hokage's decision, I think. Naruto sighed as he noticed Kakashi's dumbstruck expression. Questioning the Hokage's power was rather a faux pas. The fourth designed the seal this way for a reason. I'm certain of it. He put it on his own son, so he wouldn't leave me open to the creature's influence or vice versa if he didn't think it would be necessary. Important, even. He rubbed a hand over his seal and smiled. The fox hates that I use its chakra. He's not the one who arranged it. No, there's something else that's allowing me to channel it. I think the fourth left a little of himself behind, to guide me. We must take this to the Hokage, Kakashi said sharply, and Naruto wondered if he'd picked wrongly. The look in Kakashi's eyes, he couldn't remember seeing him like that. Immediately, Naruto nodded tiredly. The Hokage doubtlessly already suspected that he knew about Kyuubi, so the revelation that he'd been trying out using its chakra wouldn't be a big surprise. Oh, the old man probably would be mad about him doing it without supervision, but the most likely outcome of this would be that there was supervision in future experiments, probably Tenzo, rather than being forbidden entirely from pursuing this skill. The Hokage was still the Hokage, and a Jinchuriki capable of controlling their Biju would be a major boon to the village. The third was certainly clever enough to realize that banning the use of Kyuubi's chakra wouldn't be very effective anyway, as Naruto was quite capable of slipping away from most surveillance, if he really wanted to. The second part of his little story was ingenious, he thought. With the chakra of both his parents still locked in the seal, the Hokage would come across it if he really researched it, and that observation would probably set his mind at ease. Granted, Naruto couldn't actually access the chakra without it exhausting shortly thereafter, but the Hokage didn't know about that. Only Jiraiya would probably realize the truth, and he was clever enough to ask him first, which would allow him to amend the misapprehensions that the Hokage had. He wouldn't be at fault for the mistake, after all. Naruto briefly mused about the possibility of prolonging the existence of the chakra imprints of his parents, of finding a way to keep them around. He'd never had the chance to test that concept last time, since their chakra had been long gone by the time he got any appreciable training, but if anything was going to allow that, it'd be Fūinjutsu. Naruto mused about how much nonsense he'd be spewing to excuse his recent behavior. Yes, he'd probably end up with some heavy labor as punishment for his disappearance, and his use of nastily dangerous techniques without anyone knowing, but that was alright. He needed to get stronger anyway, and he didn't mind the hard way so much anymore. Not since he'd helped rebuild the town, after Nagato had blown it up, and his army of clones had worked themselves and him into exhaustion. Perhaps the physical exercises coupled with some serious chakra training would be enough to get him ready for things to come. The Naruto clones were remarkably silent, which was a small blessing, he supposed. They mostly wandered around reading scrolls, writing, playing silly games with each other. Gaara didn't know what to make of it, and just stared at them with a blank look. He had spent the past 2 days trying to get free, with the little window high up in the room being his only way of determining the time that had passed since he'd been caught. In that period he'd been offered food several times, though he had refused out of fear of poison, of assassination. After the second day of refusing to even drink, one of the clones had gotten fed up and forcibly poured water down his throat. Thus far, it didn't seem like that had contained any dangerous compounds, though Mother would doubtlessly take care of them. If she was still there. Gaara didn't know what to do, what to say that he hadn't already said. It had taken only a few hours before his rage at being caught by the enemy turned into confusion and crazed terror. Not only was Mother silent, but the enemy's clones didn't show any signs of going away or letting up on watching him, and he'd been tied up quite effectively. Without his control of the sand, Gaara realized he didn't have any appreciable ninja skills he could use. Even if he did escape, he probably couldn't keep all those clones off him for long. He remembered well that the white-haired shinobi that caught him, which had been this Naruto, in disguise, had evaded him quite effectively, and then managed to knock him out in one blow. He couldn't underestimate the boy. Killing had been the way he'd lived for years now. Either you died or you made people dead, and there was no middle ground. Something like this, capturing someone alive and keeping them tied up for no discernible purpose, wasn't something he had even considered a possibility. Kidnapped by another Jinchuriki, a foreign ninja, and he didn't know why. Downloading streaming TV guides. Gaara had never really thought of himself as being a Jinchuriki. He'd heard the term, knew that it applied to him, but any talk of others that might exist was quickly glossed over or ignored. Until this, Naruto, he'd never met another. Now, he finally had an idea about why that was the case. Jinchuriki were dangerous, as far above shinobi as shinobi were above villagers. Many people had tried to end his existence in the desert. Genin, Chunin, Jonin, they all died. It had taken another of his own kind to actually knock him unconscious, though. "You look tired," one of the clones commented as he stepped closer. "You can sleep, you know. The seal keeps the Aikibi from interacting with you at all." "I don't sleep," Gaara said simply, staring at the clone. The clone shrugged. "Well, you're used to being awake, I suppose. Don't you want to rest a little, though? The boss will probably be gone for a few days anyway, so it's not like you'll have an awful lot to do. Unless you want to play Go with one of us, I guess. Though, I must admit, we're all equally bad at it." Gaara just glowered. "Well, no need to be so moody," the clone said, squatting against the wall across from Gaara's position. "Gaara, you know we're not trying to hurt you, right? I know you hate being tied up and not having your sand to protect you, but I'd expect that you can deal with that. You don't have to listen to the Aikibi anymore, and you're not in danger of being." He yawned. "Besides, it's not as if you left much behind in Suna, aside from your siblings. I've already considered letting them visit, so relax." For a few minutes it was perfectly silent. Then, Gaara spoke. "Am I a hostage?" "Hardly." The clone raised an eyebrow. "Boss was actually truthful about that. Your dad agreed to let you spend some time in the Land of Fire as payment for a mistake he made. He knew the awful existence you had in Suna, so he wanted to help you out. In any case, you'll be allowed to go wherever you want, in time. You simply can't be seen in Konoha, right now. It'd make a lot of people very nervous." Gaara glared at the clone. "You can't keep me like this. We don't intend to. We're just waiting for boss to return. Now, want to play Go?" The clone smiled. "Don't worry, it doesn't hurt. You're pretty clever, I'm sure you'll enjoy the distraction." Doubtful. He stared ahead blankly, his mind racing. He was going to get out of here, but how? The shadow clones would last for a while, and he'd need to eat at some point. Perhaps then he could get free. He rubbed his arms against the rope. It would take time before he could cut through the material, but slowly but surely he was doing it. He smiled darkly. The Hokage slammed his fist down on his desk. "You have been doing what?" Naruto almost flinched, but forced himself to keep still. This was hardly the time to get nervous. If he was going to keep living here, he had to make sure that everyone knew what he was like. Not the him that should have been here, the 11-year-old idealist, but the one that he'd become, the man who ended the Fourth Shinobi World War and was a hair's breadth from the Hokage's hat on more than one occasion. Granted, he hadn't changed that much from his first genin days, not really, but being an experienced shinobi was certainly not something that would fit well with his younger self's reputation, so he'd need to make clear that he worked to get better. Only that would allow him to show prowess beyond his rank and not end up in Ibiki's tender mercies. The Hokage was probably the person who knew him best in the village, at least as a kid, and even he only spent a fraction of his time paying attention to him, lying to his face was nigh impossible. He'd need to spin the truth. He'd speak about things that really happened, that he really did once upon a time, and let the surprise and shock of the relation to Kurama take care of the suspicion. I've been training with Kyuubi's chakra, he repeated. Only experiments, of course, nothing big. You know who made the seal, so that should tell you something about why. Naruto said, frowning. The fourth Hokage didn't make this a seal by accident, and I'm sure you know that. He built it so that I could channel the fox's power, not just as a prison. I've been very careful in only trying little bits at a time. Uzumaki Naruto, the Hokage said sharply, leaning forward. You will not be channeling the creature's chakra again. Do you realize what could have happened if you foolishly went too far? What horrors you might have unleashed? Naruto nodded. I could have blown up everything in my vicinity with the wild chakra, until I triggered one of my seals. Then I'd be knocked unconscious, and the chakra would dissipate. Anbu would be at the site long before I regained consciousness, and Konoha would have a new clearing. He sighed at the dangerous glint in the old man's eyes. Hokage-sama, he continued, mindful to use the title, I'm a Jinchuriki, and you must have read the scrolls, just as I have. I'm a living weapon, whether I train to use the Kyuubi's chakra or not. If I do nothing but wait, sooner or later things will go wrong, horribly wrong, and I'll tap into it subconsciously. The chakra is powerful, seductive. I would everyone in the madness that followed. Using that power could break the seal, the Hokage responded. Break the Kyuubi's seal, and release it back into the world. I cannot risk such a thing happening again, not as long as I am Hokage. Once was more than enough for any village to bear. Naruto sighed tiredly. The seal will hold at least until I reach several tails of power, he said. At least 6, I believe, if it is not reinforced. I can currently control only 1, and that is how far I've gone. Naruto made sure to avoid mentioning that he could in principle go up to 5, right now. He'd never tried, but he knew from his last life that with enough mental fortitude, it should be possible. Jiraiya hadn't tinkered with the seal yet, which prevented him from going beyond that entirely, but it was rare enough that anything could beat that kind of power. Unfortunately, telling that to the Hokage would reveal that he knew exactly how his seal worked, which was problematic, since Jiraiya had the key. You were disturbingly casual about multiple tails worth of a demon's energy, Naruto. It's my power now, old man, Naruto pointed out. I can summon it at will, as a lethal secret weapon. Few things could withstand the chakra, let alone the physical augmentations. The seal was made to be used, and I know there are others like me out there. There are other Jinchuriki with their own seals and Biju, treated like living weapons. Some of them have worse lives than I do, and I have gone through quite a bit. He shook his head. I can sense them, you know. He couldn't, not without Kurama's help, but who would dispute his claim? He was fully aware of where each other host was at this point in time, which effectively meant the same thing anyway. If he was not mistaken, his letter should have reached one of them by now. He wondered if B would respond personally. He hoped so. Subscribing to anime streaming services. The Hokage seemed shell-shocked by his statement. You can sense them. I have the Kyuubi locked within me, Naruto said dryly. When I use its chakra, the chakra of the others call out to it, as my demon is the strongest of them all. I know where the others are, and I know who are carrying them. Most of them know quite a bit more about channeling their inner beast than I do. He shook his head. I appreciate that you want to protect me, but you should really think ahead. I've been training myself, readying myself. I've already shown Kakashi more than I'm strictly comfortable with, and I'd rather keep the nasty stuff away from the other genin, but you know that I'll need it. One of these days, one of the others is going to come here, or someone will come hunting. You'll want something to counter them with. A weapon of your own. Naruto, the third looked at him with a pain-filled gaze, the anger and panic making way for a deep-seated regret that sent shivers down Naruto's back. He knew the third had cared, it had been many years, and the old man had become something of a warm childhood memory. Seeing him like this, even causing this, it felt terrible. Still, he'd had a childhood like the third wanted, and a great few years on the road with Jiraiya, and a lengthy and exciting shinobi career without relying on his status as Kurama's host for most of it. This time around, he didn't need to repeat all that, he could cut right to the chase, and make the world better. He was a chosen one, after all. It's my choice to make. I am serious about wanting to become Hokage, you know. He smirked widely. The way I see it, this gives me an extra boost. The third sighed. I sought to avoid giving you such a life. You don't know what you're suggesting, this way is filled with only pain. I wished to give you a life as a shinobi. You'd be considered a tool by some, perhaps, but one with freedom. I don't want to send you down the dark path that lies in being the channeled of that awful power. Jinchuriki are considered cursed beings for a reason. I believe this one will surprise you, Naruto said. I am better than people assume, both in my ninja skills and otherwise. Yet, I'm just a genin, and beneath most people's notice. You know that having someone like me around can be of great use to the village, especially if I keep getting better. He glanced at the door uncertainly, but he sensed nobody nearby. Well, now he was here, and he had the Hokage actually listening to him, for once. There was one thing he'd need to make sure happened before the Chunin exams, taking out Orochimaru's spies, including Kabuto, and make sure Sasuke was protected, if someone he didn't foresee was after his teammate. He'd need to do a bit of fibbing, but he knew that the Hokage took his word seriously. He had a reputation as a rabble-rouser and a thief, but not yet as a liar. He glanced at the door uncertainly, but he sensed nobody nearby. There's one thing that I have to report, and now is as good a time as any. Something I found out shortly before I came back here. There is an assassin after Sasuke. The Hokage inhaled sharply, though Naruto wasn't fooled. The old man would hardly be surprised by someone gunning for the last Uchiha. Do you know who? Not by name, but I came across a ninja yesterday, Naruto responded. He wore a mask with a musical symbol on it. He stopped near the location out in the woods that I used to train. I followed him with shadow clones, curious, and listened in on him. You know I'm pretty sneaky. I'm pretty sure he didn't notice me at all. He smiled thinly. He and another man with light gray hair and glasses talked about someone I'd heard about before, so I was curious. They spoke about Sasuke's eyes and bringing them to Orochimaru of the Sannin. Seriously, his eyes. Disgusting. The third's gaze darkened. I see. What else did you hear, Naruto? This is very important. Please be as accurate as you can. Naruto almost smiled. Gotcha. Granted, Orochimaru didn't want to as much as kidnap Sasuke, but this way he'd get better protection for his teammate than just a lookout. Naruto thought about how he'd implicate Kabuto, and he only needed a second. They talked about Sasuke's eyes, about the Sharingan, and about medical techniques to obtain those eyes and implant them. A few hours later, one of my clones back in Konoha popped and I discovered that some person had attacked Sasuke, so I feared those ninja already succeeded and went back to the village as soon as I could. That's when Kakashi-sensei found me. Any in-depth research into Kabuto's activity would probably reveal his contacts with the Snake Sannin, after which he'd swiftly be dealt with, but that did mean he'd possibly be sending the Hokage and investigators down the wrong path in researching what really happened to Sasuke. Well, he supposed he did have rather little information to go on, but with everyone so secretive about it that even his clones found nothing, it did seem like they were grasping at straws. Clearly they hadn't caught the perpetrator yet, or this wouldn't even come up. Well, this just meant he'd have to deal with the attacker himself. Did these two ninjas say when they meant to attack? Any specifics would help, the Hokage asked, and Naruto frowned. The unmasked man, I didn't hear a name, but I'm pretty sure he's from Konoha. He talked about the exams, the Chunin exams. He said something about talking it many times already or something like that, Naruto said, thinking back to the first time he'd met that creep. Is that what you mean? The Hokage had a glint in his eye that Naruto thought meant very bad news for Kabuto. Perhaps he'd just managed to remove his own shot at taking revenge on the man, but he was pretty sure that Ibiki would be a lot less direct about it. The Hokage frowned at Naruto, though much of the earlier tension was gone. Good. The third cleared his throat, narrowing his eyes at Naruto. Don't think that coming across such information gets you out of the trouble you have worked yourself into, Naruto. You abandoned your ninja duties, even if they were D-rank missions, and as such I'll have to stop paying you for at least 2 weeks, and you'll be serving community service. If there is a next time, the punishment will be more severe. That's good, Naruto said, shrugging. I've been meaning to sell some of my seals, which should hold me over for a while. Naruto, the man hesitated, and for a long moment Naruto wondered if he was just going to end it there. Then, he spoke again. The next time you wish to go out of town for this training, come to me. If this is what you believe you have to do, then I will see to it that it is done as safely as possible. There is someone that might be able to help with this, though I don't know if, he hesitated. You are spreading yourself awfully thin, Naruto. Genin training, seals, this. You have so much time, yet. Quote, well, I always have my clones if there's not enough of me, Naruto said with a vague smile. I have to become the best, he added. I've got something to live up to, after all. You want to bet whether I'll beat my dad's age for getting that hat? The Hokage chuckled slightly, though his heart wasn't in it. You truly are the most surprising ninja in the village. His face turned stern. If you leave the village again without informing anyone, you will be suspended from the shinobi force. If the wrong people know about this before you've mastered it, you could be in serious trouble. Understood. Discovering martial arts cinema, Naruto nodded warily, and it was lucky that the Hokage didn't notice that the boy was only barely keeping in what could only be described as a cackle. That had gone better than perfect. The only way it could have been better was if Jiraiya walked in right now. Nobody. Bummer. He couldn't keep this up. Lying to Kakashi, to the Hokage, he was bound to slip up. Granted, few would jump to the conclusion that he was from another time. That was pretty crazy, but perhaps they'd assume him a spy, or even under Kurama's influence, both of which could land him in prison with chakra-draining seals on every surface. He needed to figure out a way to combine his changes with his public activities, and soon. Jiraiya could help, he supposed. Naruto shivered as he left the building, making his way towards the hospital. It had gone perfect, hadn't it? Why then did he feel like he was balancing on the point of a kunai? Why did he feel like the whole world could fall to pieces? Are you insane? Why do you ask? Naruto wondered, hanging from the ceiling in Sasuke's room by his feet. I just figured that since someone put a warning seal on the floor, probably a nurse, I'd use an alternative way of reaching you. Besides, ceiling running is a great way to train your chakra and muscles simultaneously. Whatever, Sasuke muttered, groaning. Why are you here? Honestly, I came to see how you were doing, Naruto answered, shrugging. It isn't much more complicated than that, really. I'm extremely curious who finally managed to put the mighty Uchiha in a hospital bed, but if you don't want to tell. Sasuke scowled. It's not important. Someone broke several bones and turned your chakra system into such a crazy mess that you aren't allowed to use jutsu for more than a week. I'd say that counts as pretty important. I don't care much for people who hurt others, especially teammates. He edged his head to the side. You're still that, at least. Whatever. Look, Sasuke. Naruto sat down on the ceiling, staring at the other boy. You've already asked me for a seal, so I know you don't think I'm a total idiot. You've probably figured out that I'm better than I seemed back at the academy. Sakura's got a lot more potential than you give her credit for, too. I bet you she'll be the next Tsunade of the Sannin. Sasuke snorted. As if. I believe it, and I'm not a bad judge of character, Naruto said pointedly. I'm saying. Someone attacked you, and took you out. You've got strength on your own, sure, but you're a genin, you can't beat the best. Not yet. He smiled. Remember the fight against Kakashi. Granted, he wasn't going all out, or he'd have flattened us, but we beat him. We managed to get the drop on a Jonin and fulfilled our task, and the only reason it worked was because we worked together. What are you saying? Alone, I think you could become the next Kakashi. Naruto said, and he didn't miss Sasuke perking up. Being compared to one of the best shinobi of the Leaf did wonders, even if they knew the man was also a bit of a slob. You could beat your enemies with the Sharingan and powerful jutsu that you copied. A worthwhile goal, Naruto allowed. But together, you, me, Sakura, I think we could go beyond that. Be something better. I've already said Sakura could be the next Tsunade, and if I'm not too arrogant here, I'm getting lessons from Jiraiya soon in sealing. I'd like to be the next Toad Sage. There are 3, however, in any team. Sasuke shook his head, vaguely amused. The traitor. Details. Orochimaru might be a traitorous, but you can't deny he's a damn powerful shinobi. I wouldn't be surprised if he could take out the Hokage, if he really tried. He shook his head sadly. Think about that, would you? I'd even help you with that ambition of yours. And find whoever put you in the hospital, I suppose. You don't even know what happened. Even if it was Kakashi himself, I'd kick there, Naruto retorted, smiling. Get out of here soon. I'll have your personal seal ready when you do. I think you'll enjoy it, it's a modified fire one. After that, I'll try and convince Sakura that she can be better than she is now. I think your help would be useful, there. Sasuke rolled his eyes, but at least he hadn't sent him out yet. Having one-sided conversations was nothing new with the Uchiha. We'll storm the ranks so quickly that nobody will even believe it, Naruto swore. After all, I'm going to be Hokage, and sooner, rather than later. Now you're just getting pretentious. Just watch me, bastard. He smiled, waving as he left. The sensation that things were going to go very, very wrong hadn't left throughout the conversation. Naruto shivered as he stepped back out into the open air. There was something wrong, something in the air. He could sense it. Or, perhaps not him, precisely. Naruto glanced down at his stomach in consternation. He'd sensed negative emotions before, when he was using Kurama's power in his Nine Tails chakra mode. That wasn't anything new. What's new was feeling it without even using its chakra. A very worrying thought occurred to Naruto. Something had upset the Nine Tails, had infuriated it, so much that even the host picked up on it. He'd need to talk to his tenant, and soon. After all, what the hell would scare Kurama? Naruto breathed in deeply, trying to ignore the pervasive feeling of fear that was still creeping up on him. The Hokage monument looked out over the entire village, and Naruto remembered many a time he'd been up here before, studying the people who were like ants on the ground far below. It was one of the calmer places he knew in the village, perfect for his purposes. His heart was racing regardless of his intentions, but stress was nothing new. He forced his thoughts to slow down by sheer will, a form of meditation that was considered insane by most people, since it wasn't exactly focused on being calm. It worked, though. Naruto didn't even sense the transition. He suddenly stood in ankle-deep water, a vague stench of something decomposing wafting through the air around him, if it could be called air. Perhaps the memory of dank air. He opened his eyes and looked around curiously. He hadn't had a reason to come back here for years now, and he'd almost forgotten how crappy it looked. His subconscious was dank and flooded, and pipes ran across the walls and ceiling, branching and looping back on themselves. He'd never quite found out why it was like this. Ino had hinted she knew the reason, and considering her family's speciality, he wouldn't be surprised, but she'd been unwilling to disclose it. Turning around sharply, Naruto gazed neutrally at the massive gate that towered over him, remembering the many times he'd stood here in the past, terrified out of his mind or dead set on beating Kurama down. He'd never really talked to it, not beyond that time Sasuke had made his way in here, and had conversed with the demon. Naruto wondered what to say to the Biju. Hey, you don't know me, but I'm going to beat the crap out of Madara Uchiha when I come across him, perhaps. He supposed that lying to the Kyuubi would be pretty pointless, as the creature had a front row seat to what he did. Perhaps it'd already know all about what he'd been up to, and why. Had Kurama been active this early in his ninja career? Naruto wandered closer to the gates, staring at the little paper that was keeping the gate closed grimly. It was the physical manifestation of the seal his father had placed there, and one time he'd nearly ripped it off under his influence. He had to remember the fox was formidable. Kurama, Naruto shouted at last, knowing that would certainly get the Nine-Tails' attention. For once, he wouldn't have to lie. The fox certainly was in no position to go blabbing, and he had just as much reason, or more so, to want to keep such secrets to himself. A more powerful, more disciplined Jinchuriki might just be able to pull off what the young version couldn't, after all. Kurama, Nine-Tailed Fox, I want to talk to you. After a few long moments, two great eyes appeared behind the gates, joined quickly by a massive maw of gleaming teeth that seemed to grin at his host, who was minuscule in comparison. Naruto almost took a step back as it snorted in disgust. The fox gazed at him and shook his head. So, it is you. What do you want? To talk? Naruto said simply. It's been a while. Not that you'd know. Kurama lowered his gigantic head, staring at the tiny human that stood before his prison's gate with a malignant glare. You have some guts to demand to speak to me, pathetic morsel. I would eat you alive, but this seal. He growled, raking its paw down the gate, and it didn't budge an inch. Naruto shrugged, unconcerned. I came here because of you. You've been freaking out, sensing something that I can't. Whatever it is, it's affecting me on the outside. His hand strayed to his stomach. You're leaking out your emotions, and that's definitely not normal. It's probably since I'm more attuned to you than I should be, but it's definitely new. What gives? You show no fear at all, Kurama said, narrowing his eyes. You claim I am leaking emotions. He continued, the slight widening of his eyes the only sign that it was surprised. You have not used my chakra. I would know if you had. You are wrong. Afraid not. Naruto stepped forward, staring at the little seal paper on the door. The Hake no Fūinjutsu, my seal, is special. It's built up out of 2 Shisho Fuin or 4 symbol seals, but they're not quite touching. There is room for chakra to escape and merge with my existing natural reserves, thereby adapting my body to its nature. I can't even sense it as different from my own anymore, but if you were feeling something strongly enough, I suppose it would leak through with the chakra anyway. He frowned. Only the most intense hatred or fear could come through without loosening the seal, and Sensei hasn't done that yet. What the hell are you so afraid of? The fox snarled. You are just like that other one that locked me in this cage. He shook his head. So, he not only locked me here, but he intended to leech my chakra as well. I'm a little more like him than you probably realize, Naruto said, smirking. You are their child, I know, Kurama snapped, and Naruto blinked. So, they thought they could use me as a weapon once more, did they? Listen, big fuzzy bastard, Naruto said sharply, stepping up to the bars of the fox's prison with a glare. I know it all right. About the Sage of the Six Paths, the 10 Tails, the 9 Biju. Even Madara Uchiha's role. All of it. I don't know what exactly has got your tails in a twist right now, but I've faced this kind of thing before, and I have to know what to get ready for. I will be on the front lines when things go downhill, and I fear that might be sooner than I'd anticipated. You. Kurama narrowed his eyes. How could you possibly know such things? Naruto shook his head and sighed. Kurama, you sensed something that I did not. Something bad enough to startle you, which means that even without knowing what it is, I'm about ready to tell someone, anyone, so I can have an excuse for training my off. Tell me what the hell it was first. You can't do anything from in here, anyway, so your best bet is to count on me to take care of this for you. He shook his head when the fox didn't answer. My goal has never changed, you know. The goal of peace. My methods might have gone into a darker direction, but I still intend to bring an end to hatred, to save Konoha from itself. And to save you from the hate that consumes you, too. He smiled and looked down at his own reflection, thinking back to what happened shortly after the Fourth Shinobi World War. What happened to him and B, the last two Jinchuriki left alive? He couldn't suppress a shiver. He calls himself Toby these days, if you must know, Naruto said, sighing. I know about him, I'm aware of what he did. I also know what he plans to do, which is much worse than anything you've seen yet. The attack on Konoha that left me a Jinchuriki was orchestrated by that man, and it was child's play compared to this. He frowned as he paced back and forth through the shallow layer of illusionary water. When and where did you sense him? I do not know. I only care that he was too close. Kurama turned away and its huge tail swished back and forth in agitation. I will not allow myself to be controlled again. I will not. I won't allow it, anyway, Naruto assured him, sighing. He kept up a facade of certainty for Kurama, but his mind was racing. Toby was in the village, right now. Had that happened, the last time? What had he been doing, right this moment? What could have changed it? He stopped, and exhaled slowly. Of course. The wave mission, he breathed, staring at Kurama. I haven't been nagging the Hokage for AC rank missions since I was using clones and they'd just get popped, so we've been training and doing D ranks instead. I forgot that I nixed that mission entirely. Damn it. This means Toby could have been in the village the last time, but we weren't there to notice him. Is this a coincidence, or? Kurama scoffed. You speak in riddles. Hey, I'm thinking, and before you forget, we're inside my head, so I'm allowed to do that, Naruto muttered despondently. The attack on Sasuke happened on the evening before we would have left with Tazuna, if I'm right. Sasuke must have gone training then, so he was ready for the mission, and he'd have Anbu looking over him. This time around he was probably in bed, and there's nothing at all where he lives. Damn it! Did Kakashi fight Toby? Was that what everyone was hushing up? He paced, muttering under his breath. This has to be it. This was what I changed, that triggered the change. But what is Toby doing in the village, now? It's years before he started his plan. He shuddered as he thought about the implications. What if the two events were really connected? Just as I was out of town, and neither of us were there to sense Toba's chakra, he arrives to mess things up. I should have stayed in Konoha after all. What the hell did he do? Kurama snarled unintelligibly. Boy, I am not stupid, and all of this is beginning to sound like you have broken the strictest of laws. You have changed things, you destroyed the constants of time, turned back the wheel. Not even the sage was that arrogant. So, you figured that out, then, Naruto observed dryly. Took you long enough, and I question that last statement. You are correct, though, in that I stepped through time with the intent of changing the past. I'm succeeding, though it's becoming annoyingly clear that time will always find the most infuriating new path if I'm not there to steer it right. Such hubris. The fox smiled toothily. The power to change everything to your liking, to alter time itself, that is beyond any I know of. It is the ultimate space-time ninjutsu. You could the masked man, and I will have my vengeance when I consume his soul. I think you hit me with spittle there, Naruto muttered. I fully intend to take down Toby, again. He emphasized the last word, and was gratified to note that Kurama calmed at that statement. I do not claim that I can just hop back and forth in time. The power of this particular technique comes with a number of drawbacks, not the least of which is that using it more than once would be inadvisable. He shook his head. I tried sending inanimate objects, at first. It worked, and the changes were so minuscule that I was able to use trial and error to figure out the functionality of the technique. The second time I sent the same object back. He shuddered. Regardless, this was as an opportunity. It would work, once. I took that chance. It isn't even your own technique, is it? You stole it. Kurama seemed to be rather gleeful about discovering his host was less scrupulous than he'd perhaps anticipated. Why did you use it? Naruto sat down on the ground, floating on top of the thin layer of water effortlessly with a slight release of chakra. When I chose to go back, things weren't yet at their end, but I could predict how things were going to go if I stayed. I wanted to leave when I still had the hope and spirit that Jiraiya-sensei gave me, the dream of peace. I knew it was getting squashed, slowly, and it terrified me. I was turning into Nagato. He frowned at Kurama and shook his head. I suppose that tells you nothing, though. It was more than 25 years from now, and during most of that period, there was a supposed peace. The only thing that meant was that none of the great nations were actively warring at the time. Satellite countries were used as the weapons, competing with each other in lieu of the larger nations, who wished to retain the pact made at the end of the Fourth Shinobi World War. All the cage that survived signed it after all. He sighed as he thought of all the awful things that had happened during that nominal peace. It had truly been peace in name only. It was during that long period that he'd gone from the bright kid that everyone knew to the shinobi that would remain an S rank in all foreign bingo books. Sometimes, they'd even put down a flee on sight order, which he'd bragged about quite a bit. Sakura in particular had gotten quite annoyed at that. Sakura had been one of the few constants in his life, even when she became a full-fledged medical nin and perfected her fighting style, which mostly involved punching things so hard they broke. Courtesy of her sensei, Tsunade, of course. That Sakura was gone now, but hopefully she'd reach that level sooner, this time around. Martial arts. The long false peace didn't last. Shortly before I left, the Fifth Shinobi World War was starting, and Konoha was once more in the middle of it. The instigators were Kiri and Kumo, both losing a great many clients to the more prosperous nations. After a rogue ninja took out the Mizukage, a far more aggressive woman took the helm, and that was the beginning of the end. The first battles were awful. I was right there, on the front lines, ing by the dozens, hoping that I could stop it before it got too bad. We were losing. It didn't look it, but our side was getting more savage over time, and theirs, they hadn't even broken a sweat. Attack after attack, and the enemy never wavered. They'd been building up an army for ages, while Konoha had been reticent to do so, trusting that the peace would last. It was like Nagato's predications had come true. Violence just begat more violence, and the idealistic idea of a peaceful shinobi cooperation died when our difference proved greater than our similarities. Yet, I think we can still do it. Perhaps if we can come together over something other than a war. Perhaps I can show the world the truth about the Jinchuriki, about the Biju, before the dawn. Kurama stared. You mean to tell me that you went back because you might have lost? Cowardice. Is it cowardice, when you know the end is inevitable? He shrugged. The war, it was getting even bigger than before. Nastier, too. I visited all the shinobi nations to gather intelligence on their capabilities, as I'd gotten pretty good at spying. For a while I was an assassin too, leaving dead bodies in my wake in a desperate attempt to save what could be saved. It was definitely not the way I'd intended things to go. It was the only way, though, that Konoha might survive. Until this. He waved around and shrugged. The return. It was a one-way trip, I was fully aware of that, and I wouldn't get another shot. That's why I haven't told people, among other reasons. If anyone found out about my methods of returning, they would go find it themselves. As soon as I have the ability, I will find a way to destroy it, or to block it off. I cannot risk Toby or anyone else finding my path back. It took me a long time to find, you know. I'd hunted the legends for months, unaware of what exactly I was looking for. Beyond that was a scroll that once belonged to a certain sage. He winked as Kurama stepped back. Yup. The sage of the six paths himself designed my method of return, and I have no doubt he built the limit for only one return into the seals himself. They're so far beyond me I don't even know where to start with figuring them out. I had to go by the warnings written on the scroll itself to know what it was even for. I don't know if the sage ever used it, but clearly he intended it to be used again, or he would not have included those. He smirked. So, what was that again, about arrogance? The sage. You liked him a lot, didn't you? Naruto said wistfully. I remember that look in your eye, or the one you will have in the future, I suppose. I've been compared to the sage an awful lot, I've always wondered if we really are similar. You look nothing like him, brat. Not now, perhaps. Naruto smiled. There was a time when I could summon a shroud of chakra as he did, far in the past. You and I had a sort of understanding. Our chakra was our chakra, then. Not yours, not mine, not separated like it is now. This seal was gone. He put his hand on the paper and felt the remnants of his father's chakra beneath his fingers, though it was now maintained by Naruto's own chakra. Somewhere, here, there was more chakra of the man, enough to manifest a full person, but today was not the day to call on that. In any case, the fourth was doubtlessly listening in right now, however you did that is pure chakra. He looked back at Kurama with a sigh. For a time, we were allies, even. Switching back and forth in the same body whenever we wished. Then, things went wrong. I won't bore you with the details, the events are unlikely to repeat themselves here, if I can help it. You were gone. Gone. The fox crashed into the gate and snarled. Impossible. I never found out how they did it, Naruto commented, shaking his head. I don't think you were dead, just elsewhere. Taken. You and the 8 tails, the only unsealed Biju that remained. All 9 vanished. For a time, I was convinced that Toby hadn't died, that the one we remembered had been a decoy. I even considered that he'd been successful, that his plan had worked, and we were all caught in a dream. In the end, I never did find out. We will speak of this again, Kurama growled, staring at his host with something between distrust and curiosity. Our time is over. The masked man is gone, he continued. Your Toby has left the village. The reason for it is another strong source of chakra, approaching swiftly. Naruto nodded and blinked as he realized that he was up on the Hokage monument again, shaken out of his trance. That had been a one-sided talk. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed a listening ear to voice what happened, even if it was to a gigantic monster fox. Probably that said some pretty awful things about his psyche. Anime and manga. What had Kurama meant? That the reason for Toba's departure was approaching. He stood up, staring over the village, and a flash of white crossed multiple roofs in a single stride, skipping some. Naruto couldn't suppress a smile. Took you long enough, he murmured. Jiraiya of the Sannin glanced up at the Hokage monument for a moment, as if sensing Naruto's presence upon it, then entered the Hokage's tower. How come I'm the only one here? Sakura said, fuming. Seriously. The only one? Kakashi raised an eyebrow. I believe I've been overlooked again. Did I put on my camouflage gear this morning? Sakura scowled. You know what I mean. The mission was supposed to start 2 hours ago. Sasuke's in the hospital, but where is Naruto? Kakashi glanced worriedly towards the Hokage tower. There were some personal issues that he needed to resolve. I imagine he needs a little time alone, now. I'm sure he'll be back tomorrow. He leaned against the bridge with a sigh. With both of the boys missing, I suppose that makes me your personal teacher for the day. Can we go see Sasuke? Kakashi groaned. Sasuke will be alright. The hospital's guarded by Anbu, they know what they're doing. Now, we should focus on you. He gave her a lazy look with his one eye. Genjutsu again. You know you're going to end up lagging behind the others if you don't keep up your training, right? Before Sakura could speak, Kakashi raised his hand. I know your opinion on Sasuke and Naruto. You're doubtlessly under the impression that Sasuke's the best at everything, and Naruto is the dead last who got obsessed with an obscure shinobi technique and doesn't know much else. Sakura hesitated on denying the descriptions, and that was answer enough. Kakashi leaned back and shrugged. What if I told you that Naruto could beat Sasuke in a fight, even if both were fully healthy? Sakura rolled her eyes. You'd be lying. Would I be? Kakashi shook his head. You haven't really seen through Naruto's facade, even now, have you? The one who wishes to study genjutsu can't even unravel a genin's admittedly impressive deception. He shook his head. I suppose that is irony for you. Do you really? Oh, I believe we'll see Naruto and Sasuke face off, sooner or later. Think back to your genin exam. It was Naruto that brought you three together, and ultimately used the winning strategy. No, he didn't think of it, but that's the core of teamwork, isn't it? Kakashi stared out over the little stream that gurgled under his feet. I haven't seen him in action, really, but the way he moves and acts. I'd think he was a chunin or jonin, not just a genin. He's remarkably perceptive, too, especially for his reputation, so I imagine he saw many things without people realizing he was even paying attention. Sasuke's not that much different, really, you're an extraordinary team. Except for me. Sakura sighed. If that's true, then what am I doing here? If Naruto's some kind of genius and he's been faking being a loser all those years. You might not believe in yourselves, but I'm certain Naruto does, Kakashi said, smiling. I should be a fly on the wall more often. You hear the most interesting things in the hospital. Such as that orange-clad teammate of yours trying to bring Sasuke's spirits up by telling him about his grandiose ambitions. He likened his team to the three Sannin, and said you could be the next Tsunade. That, now that I think about it, would make me the third Hokage in the analogy. He smirked. Can you imagine me as Hokage? How would I even fit that hat on this haircut? Anime and manga. You'd just have Pakun wear it, Naruto said in amusement as he smoothly dropped down next to Kakashi. He'd look adorable. Also, sorry, I'm just a clone. Boss is at the tower, for reasons you can predict. Why were you listening in on Sasuke's visitors, by the way? I was hoping there would be some nurses on call, and just happened to overhear you. He shrugged. I don't get an excuse to visit the hospital very often, I usually don't get hurt. He smiled slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes, and the worried expression as he turned in the direction of the hospital was telling enough. So, you as the next Toad Sage, Yup. Naruto smirked slyly. Sasuke didn't appreciate the Orochimaru comparison much, but I think he got where I was going with it. Besides, he is a prick with a superiority complex, so it fits. Naruto. Sakura snapped, and then paused. Since when do you use words like superiority or complex? The clone rolled his eyes. I read the dictionary, of course. Clones are invaluable for that kind of thing. Sakura sighed, and then glanced up. So, you said I was like Tsunade. Naruto scowled. I didn't figure you'd get a big head from something like that. Sasuke, perhaps, but his ego's already 3 sizes too big. I said you could be like Tsunade, in time. I mean, I was going with the comparison since the Sannin are well known as some of the best shinobi of the village. I figured Sasuke would appreciate a little boost after getting his butt kicked, and I think it's something that can be done. Naruto, Sasuke didn't get his butt kicked as you seem to think. He was ambushed. That just means he wasn't paying attention, Naruto retorted dryly. Perception is key to being a shinobi, isn't that right, Kakashi-sensei? Kakashi ignored him, a small book in his hand which he flipped through casually. Naruto had practically memorized Ika Ika by now, not because he really spent too much time reading it, but because the things had been shoddily written, and he'd seen to having them republished when he noticed how many copies he'd seen around were old and yellowed. He hadn't removed any of the lewd imagery, really, it wouldn't be Ika Ika without that, but he had fixed up Jiraiya's many mistakes, including an embarrassing habit of Jiraiya to forget which book he was writing and to switch out names from one to the next, or even outright put in his own name, or Tsunade's. It was lucky she'd never read the books. Sasuke was attacked in the dark. You can't stop something like that. Naruto sighed. Sakura, tell me again, what profession are we training for? Shinobi. Right, and what's one of the core mission types for all ninja? Infiltration and assassination, correct. As genin we might not end up doing anything like that, but you know that people might die even in a C-rank mission, if you aren't careful. Sneaking in and ending someone in the night is not just a mission we might one day get. It's almost a certainty. Those are at least B-rank mission, Naruto. You won't get to anything like that until you're at least Chunin, Kakashi chimed in. You don't really have to worry about that just yet. I know, but that's not the point, is it? If you're crying foul at someone attacking in the night, you're basically saying that the ninja profession is a bad thing, and then you really shouldn't be trying to become one yourself. He narrowed his eyes at Sakura, who suddenly looked uncertain. That doesn't mean you have to tolerate this kind of attack on a teammate. Just make sure that the next time someone tries to attack him, you're ready. Ready for what? To protect him, if need be. To heal him, perhaps. Naruto shrugged. Even an elite Uchiha can be caught from behind, you know. As a kunoichi with near-perfect chakra control, I bet you would find medical techniques a lot of fun, and if you perfect your genjutsu you could be a fantastic support shinobi. Those generally don't get assigned to the bloody missions, aside from with a team. You'd probably never do a mission like that alone. Kakashi shook his head. Solo missions are definitely B rank or higher, Naruto. Don't scare Sakura with things that are years in the future. Are they? Naruto stared at Kakashi for a long moment. You know as well as I do that things can go very wrong, very quickly. How old were you when you got that eye? Kakashi just stared for a long moment, and then turned away. The Hokage told you about that. He is not the only one who knows your history, Naruto said simply. I did my research. Anyway, you already know I talked to the Hokage, and you know what that was about. Don't tell me you think I was just going out of town to train that for fun. I know you're not that naive. Kakashi didn't answer, just staring for a long while. You're more like him than I'd expected, you know. After the stories they told me about you, I figured you looked more like the other side, but I guess they were wrong. Sakura blinked confusedly. You are both confusing. What do you mean? Naruto is more like him. Like who? The Hokage. It's not really important, Sakura. Now, should we get started on something? I can't really train much like this, but I could help you out, I suppose. Naruto frowned, glancing at Kakashi. There was one thing that I wanted to show you, Sensei, watch this. Sakura blinked in confusion as her teammate edged forward. Why are you looking at me like that? Naruto smiled lecherously. Sakura-chan, do you want to go out on a date? He made an exaggerated kissing motion in her direction after that. The reaction was as predictable as it was brutal. With a shout of, Naruto! Sakura lurched forward, fuming. Her punch impacted right on the clone's jaw, and it vanished in a puff of smoke. For a moment things were perfectly silent as Sakura huffed. That's not nearly as satisfying with a clone. Kakashi just stared. That punch had been a hell of a lot faster than any she'd thrown before, and a lot more powerful. It was laced with chakra, even. Sakura, where did you learn that technique? Naruto winced, rubbing his jaw. It was a phantom pain, really, since his shadow clone's pain didn't actually get transferred with the memories, but he remembered the feeling of one of Sakura's punches well enough to know that they could be devastating, and his jaw had met plenty of them over the years. He hadn't anticipated the clone to be popped within 5 minutes, so clearly he'd been a bit more distracted than he thought when he made that clone, and it had wanted to get its job over with. He supposed he couldn't blame it. He would personally also like to leave someone else to pick up the pieces, sometimes. His worried thoughts about Toba's involvement ate much of the enjoyment out of the moment that a reunion with Jiraiya should have been, and he hoped he could set that aside, at least for a moment. There was one thing that had him worrying, though, something that had come up early in conversation when he'd arrived at the bridge. Kakashi had definitely not been at the hospital when he was. Naruto had thoroughly checked and double-checked that he was alone, and he was good enough to spot Anbu. Kakashi lurking nearby would have stood out. The only conclusion, then, was that Sasuke's room was bugged. His teacher and perhaps the Hokage himself were listening in on everything that Sasuke was doing, possible even watching him. That meant that his theory on Toba's connection with the events surrounding Sasuke suddenly got a lot more credible, since they wouldn't go to such lengths if there was nothing going on. This was most definitely not a good thing. Anime and manga. Staring at the closed door of the Hokage's office, Naruto frowned. He couldn't just barge in, really. He might have done so in the past, plenty of times, but right now the Hokage was well aware his clueless bravado was an act. He'd already been reprimanded for his wanderings once. He didn't want to get another one on top. He could do without Anbu tracking his every movement. Sasuke could have that dubious honor. The talk with Kurama weighed heavily on his mind, and he had trouble focusing on anything else but taking out Toby right then and there, however he could, to prevent what was yet to come. Toby had been in Konoha, in this very village, right under everyone's noses. Nobody had even noticed his presence, aside from his tenant, and even that was lucky. Compound that with the possibility that Toby had gotten to Sasuke, chills ran down his back at the thought. Years too early, Toby was already active. Had he just made a minor shift in the man's activities, or had he actually caused things to become worse? He couldn't bear the thought of accidentally having triggered the Fourth Shinobi World War to be much earlier. If that was the case, though, then he'd need to act quickly, more so even than he'd really planned. Akatsuki had been fairly slow with gathering the Biju, last time, gathering most of them in the months preceding the war. He'd thought that he could leave most of them be for the longest time, where they wouldn't perturb events too much. That might not be an option. ERB would understand, of course, and he'd probably even help out. The man had always had a rather cheerful disposition, even if he was a menace in a serious fight. Yugito would probably help as well, if she knew the stakes. Yugura might already be a lost cause. He'd never found out when he died in the original timeline, but it was early. He could still be Mizukage, or all Naruto knew, but if he was, he wouldn't dare approach the man, as he knew who'd been lurking in the background during his reign. The twisted hands of Toby had been pulling his strings. Roshi and Han, from Iowa, were next. He didn't know much about them, but if he remembered right, they were hard-headed and steadfast, and both had only gotten visits from Akatsuki quite far into the future, which gave him some time. Then there were Utakata and Fu. How was he going to warn them all? What would he even tell them? Hey, I'm from the future, please believe me. Damn it, why did everything always have to be so complicated? You look real down, kid, a soft voice said next to him, and Naruto blinked in consternation. His eyes swerved up to meet two black eyes with red lines descending down from them. He burst into a luminous grin. Pervy sage. The white-haired sage rocked back on his heels, looking affronted. What did you call me? Jiraiya exclaimed, fuming. Why, you little runt. Is that what the first thing you say to your godfather? Well, it's true, isn't it? Naruto edged his head to the side, staring at the man before him. Oddly enough, Jiraiya actually looked younger than he remembered. Perhaps it was the lines around the eyes, or his memory was simply faulty. He couldn't stop smiling. It's good to see you again after so long. You remember that, you were paying attention then, even as a tyke. Jiraiya smirked. 11 years have passed since that. I can barely believe it, you know. Uzumaki Naruto, all grown and every bit as precocious as your old man, I hear. Found out about your family on your own, I figured the old monkey would have told you, but that works. Naruto shrugged. I took a bunch of Dad's scrolls from the Hokage Tower, and he'd scribbled down ideas for his kid's name on one of those. I found my own, circled. That pretty much told me what was going on. The Hokage actually thought it was funny that I nicked his stuff, I think. Naruto rubbed the back of his neck in embarrassment. Jiraiya laughed, and for a moment it seemed like all the problems and worries that had crept up on him were swept away, and Naruto was at peace. Jiraiya of the Sannin, his one-time teacher, and the closest thing to family he'd probably ever had. For 3 years they'd traveled the world together, and they were still some of the best he'd ever had, even with the downsides. So, you're my new teacher, then. Jiraiya smiled at Naruto and shrugged. You seem to have a pretty good idea of who I am. You looked up a little more than just your dear old dad's scrolls, did you? You know, the source of the name he finally picked for you came from something very dear to me, my first book. Aika. Pretty good, but you at editing. Naruto smiled at the Toad Sage's shocked expression. Oh, he'd missed this. Lisa changes into Anko mid-sentence for example, and then back again. Is this, Anko, another character of yours, or is she perhaps a real person? Anime and manga. Know-it-all brat, Jiraiya muttered. I should have guessed, with genes like yours. Come, let's leave the old man to his work. You and I have some seals to check, including the one on your stomach, of course. Get up, we're burning away the hours. Naruto sighed. Yes, slave driver. You meet your godson, and it's not 10 minutes before you're bossing him around. What's next? You're going to sneak out and spy on women in the hot baths. Jiraiya blinked. Well, actually, yes. You're even more predictable than I'd expected. Naruto smirked. He knew the Toby problem needed fixing, and a small legion of clones would be up non-stop to keep an eye on things. He was also aware he'd probably end up breaking a ton of laws before long, but he had to protect Konoha, now more than ever. With Pervy Sage back in town, though, he had access to one of the greatest teachers he could have hoped for, one that had things to show to even an experienced shinobi like himself, and he suddenly felt some optimism. His ticket to becoming an actual threat to half the things that were bearing down on Konoha had arrived. If he'd be rocketing up the shinobi ranks, it wouldn't be a surprise to this man. He'd taught someone like that before, after all. Between that and his covert activities in getting Sasuke and Sakura to specialize early and get a hell of a lot better, he and the village would be ready for almost anything well before Akatsuki was even an issue. But that would only work if he kept the war from starting anytime soon. He might just have to enforce that himself. Naruto summoned 36 clones, and they left immediately on their new task. There was one Jinchuriki that he had easy access to, one that might be very interested in Akatsuki's activities. Now was a good time to inform him, just in case. Perhaps it would sway the boy's mind, to know that there were people out there that would kidnap him to him, and steal his tenant. Perhaps Gaara would be the ally he remembered, once more. He really needed some allies.